Hey, guys. It's time now to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight. Together, Eleanor of Aquitaine entered the world around the year 1122, in a region that pulsed with culture, wealth, and ambition. She wasn't born into just any noble house. She was the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, a realm so vast it rivaled the power of the French crown itself. Her inheritance would one day stretch from the Loire River to the Pyrenees, making her the most sought-after bride in Christendom. But what truly set Eleanor apart wasn't just land. It was intellect. Raised in the glittering court of Poitiers, Eleanor was immersed in a world of poetry, philosophy, and politics. Unlike most girls of her era, she was rigorously educated. She read Latin, understood classical texts, and was well versed in music, law, and the strategic art of diplomacy. Her court would later be famed for inventing and spreading the ideals of chivalry and romantic love. But even as a teenager, Eleanor was more than charm and courtliness. She was being groomed to lead. Everything changed in 1137. Her father, while on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, fell ill and died suddenly. Eleanor, just 15, became Duchess of Aquitaine, a title that gave her command over nearly a third of what we now call France. But as a young girl ruling one of Europe's richest territories, she couldn't remain unwed for long. Her guardians wasted no time. Within months, she was married to Louis, the heir to the French throne. It was a political match engineered to bring Aquitaine under royal control. Days after the wedding, King Louis VI died, and Eleanor became Queen of France alongside her new husband, now Louis VII. But Eleanor was no passive queen. From the moment she arrived in Paris, her bold spirit clashed with the somber court. Louis was devout, ascetic, and inexperienced. Eleanor was lively, ambitious, and unafraid to speak her mind. The tension between them was immediate and only deepened over time. Even so, Eleanor had positioned herself at the heart of power. In a kingdom where queens were expected to bear heirs and remain silent, she was already setting the stage for something entirely different, a life that would upend tradition, challenge monarchs, and shape the future of Europe. In 1147, a monumental event shook Christendom, the launch of the Second Crusade. Cities in the East had fallen, and the Pope called upon the kings of Europe to take up the cross. Louis VII, devout and eager to prove himself, answered the call. But what shocked the continent wasn't his participation. It was that his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, would join him. This wasn't a symbolic journey. Eleanor brought with her hundreds of knights and vassals from Aquitaine, pledging them to the cause, and more unusually still, she personally led a group of noblewomen dressed in armor, riding alongside the men. Chroniclers were aghast. They accused her of playing Amazon, of turning a holy war into a parade of vanity. But Eleanor was undeterred. The journey was grueling. The army marched through France, Germany, Hungary, and finally into the rocky terrain of Asia Minor. The blazing heat and treacherous mountains drained morale. Disease spread. Food ran short. Louis, always hesitant, proved a poor commander. The French army suffered devastating losses in Anatolia. It was a failure of leadership, and Eleanor wasn't afraid to say so. In Antioch, she sought refuge with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, a brilliant and charismatic prince who ruled the city. Here, Eleanor felt at ease. Some said too much. Whispers began of late-night meetings of an improper closeness. Rumors of an affair between Eleanor and Raymond spread like wildfire. Whether true or not, Louis believed them. Enraged, he forced Eleanor to leave Antioch against her will. Their marriage, already strained, now cracked beyond repair. Eleanor had expected to lead, to advise, even to strategize. But Louis had expected silence and obedience. As they returned from the failed crusade, the difference between them was no longer tolerable. They had one surviving daughter, but no male heir. Their personalities, values, and ambitions were worlds apart. Back in France, Eleanor began pushing for an annulment. It wasn't difficult to obtain. The church cited consanguinity or blood relation, a common excuse. In 1152, their marriage was dissolved. She kept her lands, she kept her title, and within months she made a shocking move that would alter the fate of Europe. She married a young, ambitious duke named Henry of Anjou. That young duke would soon become King of England. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry, Duke of Anjou, in 1152, just 8 weeks after her annulment from Louis VII, it was a scandal. Not only was it quick, it was strategic. Henry was 11 years her junior, old and already carving out a path to power. 2 years later, he ascended the English throne as King Henry II, and with him Eleanor became Queen of England. This new union was not just romantic, it was geopolitical. By marrying Henry, Eleanor united her vast Aquitaine holdings with the English crown, creating an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. France was now surrounded by Angevin power, and Eleanor, at the center, held lands even her new husband didn't control outright. Together they were a formidable team, at least at first. Eleanor gave Henry 5 sons and 3 daughters, and she wielded real political authority, often ruling in his stead when he was away. She moved between English and French courts with grace and command, and her court in Poitiers became a beacon of art, poetry, and the ideals of chivalry. It was here that the concept of courtly love was cultivated, a romantic intellectual game that celebrated refined love and noble suffering. But even as she presided over a golden age of culture, her marriage to Henry began to sour. Henry was a tireless ruler, brilliant but ruthless. He could be cruel, dismissive, and increasingly unfaithful. His affair with the fair Rosamund Clifford became legendary, and Eleanor, once the queen of his realm and heart, was sidelined. Still, Eleanor didn't retreat. She remained deeply involved in statecraft and diplomacy. She arranged marriages for their children across Europe and advised Henry on major decisions. But behind the scenes, resentment simmered. She was no longer the young duchess, dazzled by the promise of power, now in her 40s. She saw her influence waning and her husband growing more tyrannical, not only with her, but with their sons. Eleanor's life had never followed the traditional path of a medieval queen. She had defied kings, led armies, and held her own in a male-dominated world. But the greatest rebellion of her life against her own husband was still to come by the 1170s. The dazzling alliance between Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II had withered into bitterness and distrust. Their early passion had dissolved into rivalry, and Eleanor, once the jewel of his empire, was now more like a prisoner in her own court. But she was not a woman to accept silence or submission. If her husband would not respect her, she would defy him through the one force he feared most, their sons. Henry and Eleanor had raised a dynasty of restless, ambitious boys, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. But Henry II, though brilliant, was paranoid and possessive. He refused to share real power with them, even after crowning his eldest, Henry the young king, as co-ruler in name only. Tensions within the royal family exploded. In 1173, Eleanor made a daring and dangerous move. She encouraged her sons, especially young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, to rebel against their father. It wasn't just a family squabble. It was an armed revolt with the backing of King Louis VII of France and other European nobles. Eleanor's reach, even in her 50s, was astounding. She rallied allies, forged letters, and mobilized armies against the most powerful monarch in Western Europe. For a moment, it seemed the rebellion might succeed. Henry II was caught off guard. England and Normandy were under siege, but his response was swift and brutal. The rebellion crumbled. Geoffrey surrendered. Young Henry, too weak to lead, faltered, and Richard, though brave, lacked the force to win. But the deepest betrayal Henry felt wasn't from his sons. It was from his wife. Eleanor, attempting to flee Aquitaine in disguise, was captured. She was taken to Henry's court, stripped of her authority, and placed under house arrest. For the next 16 years, she would live in confinement, move from castle to castle under constant watch. No trials, no titles, no more freedom. But Eleanor's spirit did not break. She endured. She waited, and she watched as her sons, now men, continued to battle their father and each other. She knew time would shift the power balance again. Eleanor had survived the Crusades, political exile, and 2 royal marriages, and now, in silence, she prepared for her next chapter, one that would restore her to power in a way no one saw coming. In 1183, Eleanor's life took a grim turn and an unexpected opening. Her eldest son, Henry the Young King, died of dysentery while on campaign. The rebellion he once led against his father had failed, and now, the heir to the throne was gone. With his death, a political void emerged, and Eleanor, still under house arrest, found herself once again at the center of royal strategy. Her second surviving son, Richard, bold, brilliant, and utterly fearless, now became Henry II's new heir. But trust between father and son was broken. Henry favored his youngest son, John, hoping to divide lands between them and keep Richard in check. Richard, however, wanted full control of Aquitaine, his mother's lands, and his by right. Eleanor, despite her imprisonment, remained in contact with Richard. She encouraged his ambition and loyalty to Aquitaine. She knew his strength, his charisma, and his popularity among the nobles. If anyone could outmaneuver Henry II, it was Richard, and in 1189, fate finally moved in her favor that year. Henry II, worn by age, betrayal, and illness, died. The Plantagenet king, who had ruled like a lion and imprisoned his queen for over a decade, was gone. Richard ascended the throne as King Richard the Thunder of England, Richard the Lionheart, and in his very first act as king, he released his mother. After 16 years in captivity, Eleanor of Aquitaine walked free. She was in her late 60s now, but her resolve had never weakened. Richard knew her worth. He made her his chief advisor and entrusted her with immense political power. As he prepared to launch the Third Crusade, it was Eleanor who would act as regent in his absence, ruling England in his name. She didn't waste time. Eleanor traveled across the realm, secured Richard's coronation, and quelled unrest. She negotiated treaties, settled disputes, and managed the kingdom with the skill of a seasoned monarch. Even more impressively, she arranged powerful marriages for her daughters and granddaughters, weaving the Plantagenet bloodline through the courts of Europe. Eleanor wasn't just a queen mother, she was the beating heart of an empire. And while her son went off to fight in the Holy Land, it was Eleanor, regal, sharp, and undiminished by age, who held the realm together. With King Richard I and off to fight in the Third Crusade, the Kingdom of England was left in uncertain hands, but not helpless ones. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her late 60s, stepped into power once more, and she did not simply fill a vacancy. She ruled as a true regent with all the authority and sharp decision-making of a monarch. It was an unstable time while Richard battled in the Holy Land. His youngest brother John, ambitious and reckless, began plotting to seize the crown for himself. He conspired with King Philip II of France, hoping to carve up Richard's territories while the true king was thousands of miles away. But Eleanor stood in his path. She moved swiftly, rallying loyal nobles to Richard's side, reinforcing fortresses and keeping John's ambitions in check. Even more impressively, she carried out delicate diplomatic missions well into her 70s. One of her most significant tasks was securing a politically vital marriage between her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, and the future King Louis VIII of France, a union that would have far-reaching consequences for both kingdoms. Still, trouble was never far behind. In 1192, Richard was captured on his return journey from the Crusades, taken prisoner by Duke Leopold of Austria and held for ransom. The news shocked Europe. His enemies saw opportunity, but Eleanor, refusing to let her son languish, sprang into action. Despite her age, she rode across the Alps in the dead of winter to plead for his release. She negotiated, raised a colossal ransom, said to be 150,000 marks, a sum that nearly bankrupted England and ensured Richard's freedom. Her determination and persistence stunned European courts. It was not a young warrior who rescued the Lionheart. It was his mother. Once Richard returned, their bond remained strong, but peace was short-lived. In 1199, while suppressing a rebellion in Aquitaine, Richard was wounded by a crossbow bolt and died from infection. Eleanor was nearly 80. She had outlived most of her children, and once again the question of succession fell to her. With Richard gone and John next in line, the future of the Plantagenet dynasty once more rested on Eleanor's shoulders. But for the Queen of Aquitaine, whose life had been war, marriage, rebellion, and diplomacy, one final mission still remained. Richard the Lionheart was dead. His younger brother John, now poised to take the throne, was a far cry from his legendary sibling. Unpredictable, impulsive, and deeply mistrusted by many nobles, John's path to kingship was not guaranteed. Once again, all eyes turned to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the aging matriarch whose political instincts remained unmatched. But this time it wasn't just a crown she had to secure. It was the very future of the dynasty. Even before Richard's death, Eleanor had been working behind the scenes to shore up alliances and protect the family legacy. When John ascended in 1199, she lent her name and presence to his cause, using her status as the revered Dowager Queen to legitimize his rule. Though she had long distrusted John, she understood the stakes. Without unity, the empire her marriage had created, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, could shatter. Yet Eleanor's final mission wouldn't be in England. It began in Castile, far to the south, where her granddaughter was being raised. The child, named Blanche, was to be the next diplomatic thread in Eleanor's web. The aging queen journeyed at the age of 77 across the mountains and treacherous lands of medieval France and Spain to retrieve Blanche and bring her to the court of France. There the girl would be wed to the French heir, ensuring peace between two ancient rivals. That journey was more than symbolic. It showed the world that Eleanor, even at the twilight of her life, was still Europe's most powerful political matron. Monarchs respected her. Nobles followed her. Enemies thought twice before crossing her. But time was catching up. After securing Blanche's betrothal, Eleanor returned to Fontevraud's Abbey in Anjou, a quiet religious retreat she had long favored. She withdrew from politics, not because she was defeated, but because her final moves had been made. She had ruled alongside kings, given birth to two generations of monarchs, and shaped the course of Europe through ink, sword, and silk. In her last years, she took the habit of a nun, but no one mistook her for ordinary. Even in contemplation, Eleanor of Aquitaine remained a sovereign soul, one who had written her own legend in a world built to silence women. Eleanor of Aquitaine passed away on April 1st, 1204, at the age of roughly 82. Her death marked the end of an era, not just of a queen, but of a woman who had shaped the destinies of two kingdoms and three generations of rulers. Few in medieval history had lived so long, and fewer still had lived with such influence, intensity, and independence. She died at Fontevraud's Abbey, the same quiet monastery in the Loire Valley where she had spent her final years. But this was no cloistered nun in obscurity. Even in retreat, Eleanor remained a symbol. Kings and ambassadors still sought her counsel. Nobles paid homage. Her name carried weight not just in England and France, but across the courts of Europe. She was the widow of two kings, Louis VII of France and Henry II of England. She was the mother of Richard the Lionheart and King John. She had been duchess, queen, prisoner, regent, and diplomat, and she had worn each title like armor. Her burial was no less symbolic. She was laid to rest beside Henry II and Richard I at Fontevraud Abbey, powerful men who had defined her life and whom she had outlasted. The statue atop her tomb shows her not with a scepter or a crown, but with a book, a quiet testament to her intellect, her education, and her lifelong love of learning. Even in death, Eleanor refused to be remembered as simply a queen. She was a thinker, a ruler, a matriarch, and above all, her own woman. Across Europe, the reaction to her death was one of awe and reverence. Chroniclers, even those who had once criticized her, now praised her wisdom, her strength, her grace. She had been controversial, yes, bold in her loves, unflinching in her politics, but never forgotten, never ignored. Eleanor's legacy is not just in the castles she ruled or the kings she crowned. It is in the very idea that a woman in a world built for men could claim her place, not by permission, but by sheer force of will. She did not ask for power, she embodied it. And in the tapestry of medieval Europe, her thread runs long, golden, and unbroken. Eleanor of Aquitaine's legacy is not confined to stone tombs or faded scrolls. It lives on in the very shape of Europe, in the lineage of monarchs. And in the evolving idea of female power, she was a woman centuries ahead of her time, and her influence didn't end with her death. In fact, in many ways, it began to crystallize only after she was gone. Through her children and grandchildren, Eleanor's bloodline spread across the thrones of Europe. Her daughter, Eleanor of England, became Queen of Castile. Her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, the one she personally escorted to France, will become the mother of Louis the Futurist T. Louis. Her sons Richard and John left legacies of their own, though often marked by war, controversy, and legend. But beyond royal bloodlines, Eleanor reshaped the idea of what a queen could be. Before her, queens were often silent partners, pawns of dynastic marriage. Eleanor broke that mold. She was a landowner. Her own right, a political strategist, a commander of troops, and at times the effective ruler of an empire. Her courts in Aquitaine helped birth the concept of courtly love, a cultural movement that transformed medieval literature, music, and values. Her patronage encouraged poetry and philosophy in a time dominated by warfare and dogma, and perhaps most remarkably, she achieved all this in an age when women were expected to be submissive, silent, and invisible. Eleanor didn't just defy the rules, she rewrote them. She dared to lead armies on crusade, challenge her husband's authority, raise rebellious sons, and act as regent over a volatile kingdom. She was imprisoned for her defiance, but not broken. And when the world doubted her, she endured, waited, and returned to power with grace and fire. Today, historians see Eleanor not as an anomaly, but as a turning point, a symbol of medieval female agency that stood firm amid male-dominated monarchies. She wasn't perfect. She could be ruthless, politically calculating, and at times self-serving. But she was never irrelevant, never a shadow. She was a queen who ruled through intellect, charisma, and endurance. A mother who shaped kings, a duchess who defined empires. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just live through history. She made it. Centuries before, the Mona Lisa smiled at tourists beneath soft museum lights. The Louvre was something else entirely. A fortress of stone and silence, built for defense, not displayed around the year 1190. King Philip II of France, anxious about English threats from the west, ordered the construction of a powerful stronghold along the Seine's edge. At that time, Paris was far smaller, and the western frontier of the city needed protection. What rose from the riverbank was not a palace or gallery, but a fortress thick, grim, and impenetrable. This early Louvre was anchored by a massive circular keep, tower 30 meters tall, surrounded by high curtain walls, watchtowers, and a broad dry moat. It wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was practical. Cold stone, arrow slits, iron-reinforced gates. Beneath the fortress, secret tunnels and storage chambers were carved into the ground. Corridors meant for moving supplies, hiding troops, or escaping under siege. These tunnels, some historians believe, may still lie buried beneath modern Paris for centuries. This fortress loomed over the Seine like a sleeping beast, quietly guarding the kingdom. But over time, its purpose began to fade. Paris expanded beyond its original walls. The city grew safer, and kings, no longer needing a garrison in the capital, began to look at the fortress differently. By the 1500s, it was considered outdated, militarily useless, but full of potential. Renaissance kings with visions of grandeur no longer wanted thick battlements. They wanted halls, galleries, gardens. The Louvre, though rough and ancient, stood in the right place by the river, in the heart of Paris, close to power. It was time to reinvent it. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. The old fortress was slowly dismantled, reshaped, and incorporated into new royal plans. But the bones of that original medieval beast never fully disappeared. When renovations were done in the late 20th century, centuries after the museum had taken over, workers unearthed the buried base of Philip's tower, cold, gray, and intact. Today, visitors can still descend into the Louvre's basement and stand among the stones that once guarded Paris, silent sentinels from a darker time. And beneath the polished marble and curated calm of the museum, the ghosts of a fortress still linger. By the early 16th century, the age of feudal wars had faded, and so had the need for castles within city walls. Kings no longer wanted to defend Paris with stone, they wanted to rule it with style. It was during the reign of King Francis I that the Louvre began its most dramatic transformation from a military outpost to a seat of royal power and artistic ambition. Francis III had spent time in Italy and returned to France, inspired by the Renaissance. He didn't just want a palace, he wanted a symbol of culture, sophistication, and modern monarchy. In 1546, he ordered the demolition of parts of the old medieval keep and began replacing it with elegant wings and ornamental facades. Italian architects were invited to Paris, and with them came a new aesthetic: arches, columns, and symmetry. The cold fortress slowly began to bloom into a palace. But Francis wasn't just building walls, he was building a collection. He brought Italian masterpieces back with him, including works by Leonardo da Vinci, the most famous being the Mona Lisa. Francis purchased it directly from da Vinci himself and thought it wouldn't be displayed to the public for centuries. The seeds of the Louvre's future were being quietly planted. His successors continued the work. Catherine de' Medici, widow of King Henry II, constructed the nearby Tuileries Palace and had grand ideas to link it with the Louvre. Her efforts set in motion what would become the massive palace complex stretching along the Seine. It became a symbol of the monarchy, sprawling, majestic, and ever-growing by the time of Louis the Theophile and Louis XIV. The Louvre had taken on a dual personality, half residence, half artistic epicenter. Artists were invited to live and work in its halls. Sculptors, painters, and architects passed through its corridors, some even sleeping beneath their canvases. The Louvre was no longer just a home for kings. It had become a home for creativity, yet even as elegance overtook utility, the palace remained politically potent. Behind its ornate walls, plots unfolded, alliances were forged, and power shifted hands. The Louvre was no longer built to keep enemies out. Now it was designed to dazzle them. As the Louvre evolved into a dazzling palace, it seemed destined to become the permanent heart of royal life in France. But in the 17th century, one man would change everything: Louis XIV. The Sun King, ambitious, theatrical, and obsessed with control, Louis saw the Louvre as a relic of compromise: too urban, too cramped, too tangled in old aristocratic bloodlines. He wanted something grander, purer, and wholly his own. And so in 1682, Louis XIV moved the royal court to Versailles. The shift was monumental with that single decision. The Louvre's role as the center of royal power ended. Its once glorious halls, lined with tapestries and filled with courtiers, were suddenly quiet. The king was gone, the nobility followed, and the Louvre, left behind in the capital, began to lose its luster. But it didn't fall into decay. Instead, something unexpected happened. It began to open up without the constant presence of royalty. The Louvre became a haven for artists and intellectuals. Louis XIV, though absent, had a soft spot for the arts. He allowed the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture to take up residence in the building. Studios and workshops filled the vacant rooms. Painters and sculptors worked beside philosophers and mathematicians. The Louvre transformed into a living laboratory of French creativity. During this period, the Louvre's identity became more fluid. It was no longer a fortress, no longer a royal residence. It was something between. It housed administrative offices, academies, and salons. At times it was chaotic, a patchwork of projects and unfinished renovations. But beneath the confusion, a new idea was taking shape: that perhaps this former seat of kings could one day belong to the people. There were whispers of turning it into a public gallery, a place where ordinary citizens could see the treasures their taxes helped collect. But under the monarchy, the idea remained just that, a dream. Still, the seed was planted. The Louvre, stripped of royal glamour, began to acquire a new kind of prestige, one built not on crowns and courts, but on culture and knowledge. And as political storms gathered on the horizon of France, that cultural core would become more powerful than any throne. By the late 18th century, the storm that had long been brewing in France finally broke. The monarchy fell, the guillotine rose, and in the chaos of revolution, centuries of royal tradition were torn down, including the idea that art belonged only to kings. The Louvre, once a private pleasure palace of monarchs, stood on the brink of transformation. In 1793, as the French Revolution devoured the old order, the National Assembly declared that the Louvre would become the Muséum Central d'Art de la République, a public museum free for all citizens. It was a radical concept. Art, previously hidden behind palace walls or reserved for the elite, would now be available to the common man. The first galleries opened on August 10th, the anniversary of the fall of the monarchy. The irony was not lost on anyone. Where kings once entertained mistresses and hosted masquerades, the people now walked in silence, observing canvases of saints, gods, and emperors. But the Louvre's collection needed more than just good intentions. Many masterpieces had been sold, stolen, or hidden during the Revolution. So the revolutionaries did what revolutionaries often do. Church property was confiscated. Aristocratic collections were seized. Anything that symbolized privilege was fair game. The Louvre became the great collector of confiscated beauty. And then came Napoleon. When he rose to power, the Louvre entered a new, ambitious phase. Napoleon saw art not just as culture, but as conquest. Wherever his armies marched, treasures followed, from Rome to Venice, Egypt to Berlin. Napoleon plundered paintings, statues, and antiquities. He renamed the museum the Musée Napoleon and filled it with loot from across Europe. The Louvre swelled with spoils, winged victories, Roman busts, Egyptian sarcophagi. Art was no longer just inherited. It was seized, and the museum, once a symbol of royal excess, now stood as a showcase of empire. But with Napoleon's fall in 1815 came a reckoning. Many nations demanded their treasures back. Some were returned, others mysteriously stayed. Still, the Louvre survived. And more than that, it was reborn. No longer royal, no longer revolutionary. It had become something lasting, a monument not just to France, but to civilization itself. And beneath its marble floors, the layers of history continued to deepen while the Louvre dazzled the world above ground. Beneath its stone corridors and polished galleries lay another story, one of secrets, tunnels, and whispers lost to time. Few visitors know that beneath the museum's grandeur is a network of cellars, passageways, and forgotten vaults that speak to the building's centuries of transformation. Much of the underground space dates back to the original medieval fortress when Philip II built the first Louvre in the 12th century. It included underground storerooms and escape tunnels carved into bedrock. Some were used to store arms and grain. Others, it's believed, connected to the Seine for stealthy movements during times of siege. As the fortress became a palace, and the palace became a museum, these passages were expanded, sealed, or repurposed. Some were converted into wine cellars during the Renaissance. Others were bricked up and abandoned. Their existence is remembered only in aging floor plans and royal letters. One particularly eerie structure is the remnants of the original moat, now part of the museum's basement exhibit. Visitors can walk along its cold stone edge, where the line between museum and ruin becomes thin. Here, the polished elegance of the Louvre gives way to raw medieval stone, crumbling, weathered, untouched by centuries of renovation. And then there are the rumors. Some say secret tunnels still lie hidden beneath the Louvre, remnants of royal escape routes or wartime shelters. During World War II, it's documented that certain rooms and underground passages were used to hide France's artistic treasures from Nazi looters. Paintings were created and smuggled out, but not everything could be moved. Some relics were buried deep in the Louvre's belly, surrounded by stone, guarded by curators who knew every inch of the underground map. Others claim that during the Revolution, bodies of executed aristocrats were secretly stored in the lower levels, hidden from public view until they could be properly buried. No evidence confirms this, but the myth lingers in the Louvre's walls like an echo. Today, many of these lower levels are closed to the public. Some serve logistical purposes, archives, maintenance routes, climate control zones, but others remain sealed. Inaccessible, their secrets intact. Beneath the Louvre's polished surface, the past still breathes, heavy with stories never displayed in frames. In June 1940, Paris fell under Nazi occupation. German troops marched through the city's boulevards, and the swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. The Louvre, the crown jewel of French heritage, stood ominously in the heart of it all, vulnerable, exposed and filled with priceless art. What happened behind its grand doors during those dark years remains one of the most intense and covert chapters in the museum's long history. But the Louvre was not caught off guard. Even before the Germans entered the city, French curators and art historians had begun executing a secret evacuation plan. Thousands of works, including the Mona Lisa, the Venus de Milo, and the winged victories of Samothrace were quietly removed, created in custom-built boxes and shipped to castles, abbeys, and rural estates throughout France. Convoys of trucks, disguised and escorted, carried away the nation's soul under the cover of night. It was the largest museum evacuation ever attempted. By the time Nazi officers arrived to inspect the Louvre, the galleries were eerily empty. What remained were decoy paintings, empty frames, and a skeleton staff. The Nazis, furious but impressed by the scale of the operation, repurposed the building for their own use. Some rooms were used as offices for the Kunstschutz, the Nazi division tasked with cataloging and controlling Europe's cultural property. Meanwhile, the hidden masterpieces were constantly moved across the French countryside to evade detection. Museum staff risked their lives to preserve what they called the treasure. Some of them joined the resistance. Others faked documents, forged shipping orders, or misled collaborators. The Louvre, though silenced, was not passive. It became part of a cultural battlefield. By 1944, as the Allies approached, the Nazis began retreating and looting. French resistance members worked tirelessly to protect the hidden collections from being taken when Paris was finally liberated in August. The museum's defenders emerged from the shadows, and the Louvre slowly began reclaiming its treasures. One by one, the great works returned to their home. Some had suffered, others had narrowly escaped destruction. But the Louvre had survived the war, not just as a building, but as a spirit. And in its quiet halls, you can still feel the weight of what was almost lost by the late 20th century. The Louvre had become one of the most respected museums in the world, a guardian of civilization's greatest treasures. But beneath its grandeur, it was showing signs of strain. The galleries were crowded, the entrances outdated, and the layout confusing. The museum needed a transformation, and in 1981, French President François Mitterrand announced the most ambitious modernization in the Louvre's history at the center of it all. It would be a glass pyramid. Designed by Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei, the project was bold, radical, and immediately divisive. The idea of placing a massive modernist structure made entirely of steel and glass in the middle of the Louvre's historic courtyard sent shockwaves through France. Critics called it an eyesore, a scar on the face of French heritage. One newspaper infamously described it as a monstrosity that would defile the spirit of Paris. But Pei remained calm. He believed that the pyramid, with its geometric precision and transparency, would complement the classical beauty of the Louvre, not compete with it. And more importantly, it would serve a practical purpose. It would act as a grand central entrance, unifying the various wings of the sprawling complex. Construction began in 1984 and for years. The Louvre was a construction zone full of scaffolding, noise, and controversy. Parisians grumbled. Tourists were baffled. The press debated endlessly. But when the pyramid was finally unveiled in 1989, something unexpected happened. People began to change their minds. Beneath its sleek exterior, the new underground concourse was efficient, elegant, and flooded with natural light for the first time. Visitors could move through the museum with clarity. The pyramid became a beacon, both literal and symbolic, of the Louvre's openness to the future. Today, it is almost impossible to imagine the Louvre without it. The glass structure has become iconic, featured in films, books, and photographs worldwide. What was once mocked as architectural heresy is now embraced as visionary design. The pyramid did more than modernize the museum. It reminded the world that the Louvre had always been about transformation, from fortress to palace, from palace to museum, from past to present. And as always, beneath its elegance, controversy whispered, just as it always had. For all its beauty and brilliance, the Louvre also holds shadows, stories of stolen treasures, missing masterpieces, and mysteries that have never been solved. As the museum grew in size and prestige, so did its collection. But not all of its pieces arrived by honest means. Some of the museum's earliest acquisitions came through seizure. During the French Revolution, artworks were taken from churches and aristocratic estates. During Napoleon's campaigns, the plundering became systematic. His armies swept through Europe and North Africa, stripping palaces and temples of statues, sarcophagi, and paintings. Many of these items were proudly displayed in the Louvre, renamed the Musée Napoleon, as trophies of the empire. Though some were returned after his fall, others remained. Today, debates continue over the rightful ownership of many of the museum's most prized pieces. Greece has long demanded the return of certain antiquities. Egypt, too, has pressed for the repatriation of statues taken during colonial excavations. The Louvre's Egyptian collection, one of the largest outside of Cairo, remains a source of pride and quiet controversy. But theft didn't stop in the 19th century. In 1911, the Louvre experienced its most infamous heist. The Mona Lisa. Yes, that Mona Lisa vanished from the wall. At first, no one noticed. The painting had been modestly displayed, and when it disappeared, museum staff assumed it had been taken for cleaning. It wasn't until the next day that panic set in. The investigation was chaotic. Even Picasso was brought in for questioning. But the real thief was Vincenzo Peruggia, an Italian handyman who believed the painting should be returned to Italy. He had hidden inside the museum overnight, slipped the painting under his coat, and walked out the next morning. It took 2 years to recover the painting, which was found in Florence. There have been other losses too, some small, some devastating. A royal crown disappeared during the 19th century. A priceless Egyptian statue was damaged in transport. Some artworks taken during Nazi occupation were never returned to their rightful owners. The Louvre, like all great institutions, carry the weight of its past, glorious and flawed. For every masterpiece on its walls, there's a trail of hands, choices, and consequences. Some treasures shine in the light, others remain hidden in the cracks of history. Today, the Louvre stands as more than a museum. It is a living organism, constantly evolving, shaped by centuries of ambition, conquest, revolution, and reinvention. Over 10 million visitors pass through its doors each year, wandering through over 650,000 square feet of galleries, peering at faces frozen in oil, marble, and time. But the Louvre's magic is not just in its masterpieces. It's in the weight of its past, the layering of eras beneath its floors and behind its walls. Every step through the museum is a journey through overlapping centuries. Where medieval stone corridors lie, just below neoclassical facades and digital screens share space with ancient relics. In this palace of paradoxes, Renaissance paintings hang beneath LED lighting, while Egyptian mummies sleep beneath Parisian sky. What makes the Louvre remarkable is its refusal to stay still. New wings are opened, old collections are reimagined. Temporary exhibitions bring contemporary voices into conversation with history. In 2012, the museum inaugurated a new Islamic art department housed beneath the flowing golden canopy, a striking blend of ancient tradition and modern design. But the Louvre also expands beyond its own walls. In 2017, the Louvre Abu Dhabi opened a cultural collaboration between France and the United Arab Emirates. Its architecture mirrored the light and shadow of the original, but the vision was global. Artworks from around the world were displayed together, untethered from national borders, telling stories that spanned continents and civilizations. Yet even with all this growth, the heart of the Louvre remains the same, a place where memory and imagination meet. Walk through its corridors late in the day, and you'll see more than tourists. You'll see quiet moments, a child staring into the eyes of a statue, a student sketching a forgotten corner, an elderly couple standing hand in hand before a canvas, and below it all, under the glass pyramid, behind the velvet ropes, beyond the gallery lights, the Louvre still keeps its secrets. Hidden staircases, lost chambers, and perhaps somewhere in the quiet dust of its oldest stones, the echo of a king or the whisper of a thief. The Louvre isn't just a museum. It's a memory palace, built on centuries of ambition and still writing its story. And in the spring of 1974, outside the ancient city of Xi'an in China's Shanxi province, a small group of farmers were digging a well during a drought. Their tools struck something hard, not rock but clay. First came fragments, a torso, a pair of arms, then a face staring back at them through layers of soil. It was unnerving, life-sized, hollow, yet hauntingly real. The local authorities were alerted, and soon archaeologists arrived to investigate. They had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the 20th century. As excavations expanded, the earth yielded more than anyone could have imagined. Row after row of clay soldiers emerged from the soil, thousands of them standing in precise military formation, frozen in time for over 2,000 years. Each one was unique. Different hairstyles, armor styles, facial expressions. No two were exactly alike. Some stood tall with commanding presence, others crouched in an attack stance, and they weren't alone. Clay horses, wooden chariots, and bronze weapons accompanied them, all crafted with startling realism. What had these figures been guarding for so long beneath the ground? The answer lay not far away, beneath an unexcavated mound over 250 feet high, the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China. It was he who ordered this massive underground army built, not for the battlefield, but for the afterlife. The Terracotta Army was part of a sprawling necropolis, a buried empire designed to mirror the emperor's real-world domain. Scholars estimate that over 700,000 workers may have been involved in its construction over nearly 4 decades. And incredibly, this massive wonder lay untouched and forgotten for more than 2,000 years. News of the discovery spread quickly, and the world was captivated. Here was not just a tomb, but a window into ancient Chinese philosophy, artistry, power, and belief. A civilization had poured its skill and resources into preparing one man for eternity, with an army that would never breathe, but would always stand. Yet the mystery was only beginning. Who made these soldiers? How were they crafted with such detail, and what secrets were buried alongside them? Still untouched beneath the emperor's tomb, at the heart of the Terracotta Army lies a single man's vision, a ruler whose ambition was matched only by his fear of death. Qin Shi Huang, born in 259 BCE, rose from prince to king, and finally to China's first emperor. He unified the warring states under one banner, standardized currency, language, and even axle links. But while his power shaped a nation, it was his obsession with the afterlife that shaped the underground empire he left behind. From a young age, Qin was haunted by the idea of mortality. Despite ruling with an iron fist and achieving what no other had, the unification of China, he could not conquer death. Ancient texts describe his relentless search for immortality, expeditions sent in search of elixirs, meetings with mystics, consultations with alchemists. He was said to ingest strange potions containing mercury, ironically believed to grant eternal life. But while immortality in flesh eluded him, Qin ensured he would rule forever in spirit. Around the time he declared himself emperor in 221 BCE, construction began on his tomb, an undertaking so massive it would take nearly 4 decades to complete. Unlike traditional tombs, which featured burial goods and ritual objects, Qin envisioned a subterranean kingdom, not symbols of power, but power itself. Armies, officials, entertainers, and even rivers of mercury to simulate the geography of his empire. The Terracotta Army was meant to serve as his eternal guard, soldiers to protect him in the afterlife, as they would have in life. But these were not crude idols. They were masterworks, crafted with obsessive realism, their stances and weapons reflecting actual military ranks and formations. This was not merely a monument to greatness. It was a response to fear, the fear of being alone in death, of wandering the underworld without defense or dignity. For Qin Shi Huang, eternity required preparation, and he would command an army that could not die. Ironically, the emperor's quest for eternal life may have hastened his death. The mercury-laced elixirs he took likely poisoned him. He died in 210 BCE at just 49 years old, still searching for the secret to escape time. But in a strange way, he succeeded. His body perished, but his army still stands. The Terracotta Army is not just impressive because of its scale. It's the precision, individuality, and artistry of each soldier that leave archaeologists and historians in. When we say there are thousands of soldiers, we don't mean copies from a mold. Each one is unique, as if frozen mid-step, mid-thought, mid-breath. The army is divided into different pits, each with its own composition and function. The largest pit stretches over 750 feet in length and contains infantry units in battle-ready formation. Rows of archers, foot soldiers, and charioteers stand at attention, arranged in the same military order. Used during Qin Shi Huang's reign, Pit 2 holds cavalry and war chariots, a more elite force. Pit 3 is the command center, home to high-ranking officers and military planners. It suggests a chain of command that mirrors a real army, not a symbolic one. The level of detail is staggering. Faces are individualized. No noses, brows, or cheekbones are the same. Some figures have wide jaws and curled lips. Others wear solemn, narrow expressions. Hairstyles reflect military rank and regional origin. Armor is crafted in overlapping layers, complete with rivets and clasps. Some figures once held real bronze weapons, spears, swords, and crossbows, many of which were sharp and functional even after 2 millennia underground. It wasn't just sculptors who worked on these figures. Teams of artisans, painters, blacksmiths, mold makers, and engineers contributed to their creation. After assembly, each warrior was painted in vivid colors: red, blue, green, even lavender. These pigments faded quickly when exposed to air, which is why most figures appear plain clay brown today. But imaging technology has revealed the original brilliance, offering a glimpse of how vibrant and lifelike this army once looked. Some scholars believe the level of sophistication suggests a high degree of central planning, possibly with military blueprints and social registers guiding the design. This wasn't art for art's sake. This was logistical, purposeful, a vision executed with state-level resources. The terracotta army wasn't just made to resemble soldiers, it was made to be them, each one a spirit in clay, crafted to serve their emperor in eternity and beneath the silence of the earth. They've been standing guard ever since. The creation of the terracotta army was not the work of a few artists in a royal workshop. It was a colossal, state-sponsored operation that stretched over decades and involved an entire society. Ancient records suggest that more than 700,000 laborers were mobilized to build Emperor Qin Shi Huang's tomb complex, including the vast subterranean army that stood beside him. But who were these builders? They were craftsmen. Yes, sculptors, blacksmiths, potters, and engineers, but also conscripted workers, peasants, prisoners, and even enslaved people. Some were skilled artisans, trained in workshops across the empire. Others were political prisoners and forced laborers brought to Xi'an under imperial orders. Many never returned home, according to historical texts. Workers involved in the tomb's construction were often executed or sealed within the complex upon its completion to maintain secrecy. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of kilns near the site, suggesting that many of the figures were fired on location. The clay was sourced locally, shaped in parts, and then assembled like life-size puzzles. Bodies were mass-produced using molds, but the heads, the most expressive parts, were sculpted individually by hand. This allowed for variation in features, lending a realism unmatched by any other ancient statuary army. But this was not just about statues. The labor force also carved out an entire underground city. In addition to the warriors, they constructed chambers filled with bronze birds, chariots, entertainers, musicians, and officials, all meant to serve the emperor in the afterlife. The tomb complex spans over 50 square kilometers and includes artificial rivers, celestial ceilings, and booby-trapped corridors that were likely designed to kill grave robbers. According to historian Sima Qian, writing a century after Qin's death, the emperor ordered rare jewels to adorn the tomb, ceiling to mimic the stars and flowing rivers of Mercury to replicate China's geography. Soil samples from the site do, in fact, show abnormally high levels of mercury, suggesting the legends were rooted in truth. The builders of this empire worked in secrecy and under constant surveillance. Their legacy is buried in silence. Most of their names are lost, but their hands shaped one of the greatest wonders of ancient engineering, an entire kingdom buried not to be forgotten, but to endure. At the center of the terracotta army site lies a massive tree-covered mound, a hill that looks like any other from a distance. But beneath it rests the unexcavated tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang himself, untouched for over 2,000 years. It is one of the greatest archaeological mysteries still waiting beneath the surface. Historical accounts, particularly from the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, described the tomb as nothing short of otherworldly. Inside, he claimed, were replicas of palaces and towers, rare artifacts, flowing rivers of mercury to represent China's great waterways, and a ceiling encrusted with pearls to mimic the night sky. Crossbows were supposedly rigged with automatic triggers ready to fire on any intruder who dared enter a buried universe crafted entirely for one man's afterlife. And yet no one has opened it. Unlike the terracotta warriors, which have been extensively studied and preserved since their discovery, the main burial chamber remains sealed. Why? The reasons are both practical and ethical. For one, the technology needed to excavate the tomb without damaging its contents simply does not exist yet. Archaeologists fear that once the tomb is opened, priceless artifacts, including fragile paintings, textiles, or organic materials, could be destroyed upon exposure to air. The terracotta warriors themselves lost their vibrant paint within hours of being unearthed, turning from dazzling figures to dull clay. Then there is the matter of mercury. Soil tests around the mound show elevated levels of mercury, lending credibility to the ancient texts. If true, the tomb may pose serious environmental and health risks. Some speculate that it's not only hazardous to excavate, but also deliberately engineered to deter grave robbers with traps and toxic fumes waiting in the dark culturally. There is reverence to consider. In traditional Chinese beliefs, disturbing the dead, especially an emperor, is a serious matter. Many argue that the tomb should remain untouched unless it can be entered with absolute respect and preservation. And so it waits. Beneath that quiet hill lies a secret that no one has seen in over 2,000 years. A world built for a man who could not conquer death, but who may have created a paradise to rule in it. And as science advances, the question grows louder. Should we open the tomb of the first emperor? The terracotta warriors are not simply statues. They are soldiers, and like any soldiers, they were equipped for war. Many of the warriors once held real weapons. Swords, spears, halberds, crossbows, and arrows. Weapons not merely decorative, but functional, forged with deadly precision. This wasn't symbolic craftsmanship. These were tools of war, buried in clay hands as part of a full-scale military simulation for the afterlife. When archaeologists first excavated the pits, they found thousands of bronze weapons buried alongside the figures, swords with razor-sharp edges, arrowheads crafted for distance and penetration, and even crossbow triggers made with ingenious mechanical designs. Despite being over 2,000 years old, many of these weapons remained in surprisingly good condition. Some blades were still sharp, their bronze alloys so advanced that it resisted corrosion for millennia. How did they do it? Recent studies revealed that the ancient Chinese blacksmiths coated many of the weapons with a thin layer of chromium oxide, a technique that essentially prevented rust. This technology wouldn't be reinvented until the 20th century, and yet the Qin dynasty artisans had already mastered it. Their understanding of metallurgy was far ahead of its time, evidence of a highly organized and technologically skilled society. But the weapons also served a deeper purpose. Qin Shi Huang didn't just want a lifelike army, he wanted a lethal one. These warriors were meant to fight off threats in the afterlife, just as his real troops had fought during his conquests. This wasn't a peaceful vision of eternity, it was a prepared one. The emperor intended to rule in death, as he had in life, with force, strategy, and the means to dominate. Interestingly, many of the weapons were missing by the time modern archaeologists uncovered the site. It's believed that shortly after the emperor's death, the tomb was raided or sabotaged by revolting workers or enemies of the regime. Fires were set, roofs collapsed, and weapons were stolen. Even in death, Qin's empire faced rebellion. Still, enough remains to paint a vivid picture. A silent army armed and alert, standing in formation beneath the soil, each warrior once ready to march, not in this world, but in the one beyond. While the terracotta warriors are the most famous part of Emperor Qin Shi Huang's burial complex, they were far from the only figures created. Beyond the battle-ready soldiers stood entire casts of characters, a full miniature society crafted in clay, all designed to serve the emperor in his eternal realm. Archaeologists have uncovered figures of musicians, dancers, acrobats, and strongmen, each one sculpted with the same meticulous care as the warriors, though their roles were far different. Instead of armor, they wore robes. Instead of weapons, they held musical instruments or posed mid-performance. These were the entertainers of the afterlife, created to amuse and delight a ruler who wanted his underground world to be just as lively as the one above. Officials and court attendants were also buried nearby, identifiable by their formal dress and composed postures. They represented the emperor's bureaucracy, advisors, scribes, and governors, all ready to keep order beyond the veil of death. Even stable hands, cooks, and grooms were included, depicted in kneeling or working poses, their faces captured with humility and fatigue. Then there were the animals. Terracotta horses stood beside wooden chariots, once painted and decorated. Underground stables revealed that not just sculptures, but real sacrificed horses may have once been buried for the emperor's use. In other pits, bronze waterfowl, cranes, geese, and ducks were found arranged along an artificial riverbed, suggesting that Qin's desire for replication extended even to nature itself. Each discovery added layers to the complexity of the tomb. This wasn't just a military installation, it was an empire beneath the earth, complete with its own court, culture, and daily rhythm. Scholars believe the intent was clear. Qin Shi Huang wanted to recreate the world he had conquered in life and rule it forever in death. And while the warriors march in silence, these forgotten figures offer something softer, more human. They remind us that this afterlife wasn't imagined as endless warfare alone. It was filled with music, ceremony, and the tireless hum of a royal court. They may not carry swords or wear armor, but they too were built to serve the first emperor, and they too have waited in darkness for over 2,000 years. The Terracotta Army is more than an archaeological marvel. It is a mirror of an empire at its peak. Every clay figure reflects the scale, ambition, and structure of Qin Shi Huang's unified China. His dynasty was short-lived, lasting only 15 years, but its legacy reshaped the nation, and nowhere is that transformation more hauntingly captured than in the emperor's underground army. Before Qin's reign, China was a fractured land of warring states, 7 major kingdoms constantly fighting for supremacy. Qin, the westernmost of these states, was considered a cultural outsider by some, but it had something the others lacked: ruthless efficiency. Under Qin Shi Huang, legalist policies tightened control, roads were standardized, writing systems unified, and the foundations for the Great Wall began. The Terracotta Army reflects that same structure and discipline. Soldiers are arranged in precise formations, officers in front, infantry behind, archers on the flanks. The figures even vary by region, as if modeled after real troops drawn from across the empire. It wasn't just about guarding a tomb, it was about representing the machinery of the state itself. In many ways, the army is a frozen moment, a still life of Qin's authority at its height. Yet it's also a cautionary tale, because despite all his achievements, Qin Shi Huang's rule was deeply feared. He burned books, banned dissent, and punished opposition with death. His obsession with control extended even into death, and the very monument that was meant to celebrate his immortality would eventually become a silent witness to the fall of his dynasty. Just 3 years after his death, the Qin Empire collapsed. Rebellions erupted, his tomb was raided, his son committed suicide, and the Han Dynasty rose in its place, leaving the once feared legacy of the Qin to be buried, literally and politically, beneath centuries of dust. And yet, centuries later, those silent warriors emerge again. Today, they speak not just of one man's fear of death, but of a civilization's vast reach and relentless ambition. The Terracotta Army stands not only as a tribute to the emperor who dreamed of ruling the afterlife, but as a timeless echo of a moment when all of China bowed to one throne. The Terracotta Army still stood in silence, row after row, decade after decade, watching, waiting. Not for war, not for conquest, but for remembrance. They are guardians not just of a tomb, but a moment when a man believed he could take the world with him beyond death. Emperor Qin Shi Huang dreamed of immortality. He united warring kingdoms, reshaped the nation, and spent his final years preparing for an afterlife where he would still rule. He did not settle for symbolic offerings, ritual artifacts. He built an empire beneath the ground, staffed, armed, and ordered, just like the one above. And those centuries passed. Earthquakes shook the earth and dynasties rose and fell. His creation endured. Beneath layers of soil and silence, the warriors waited. They bore the weight of time with cracked shoulders and faded paint, but their presence never weakened. Today, more than 2,000 years later, they are no longer buried. They stand under museum lights, beneath protective canopies and curious eyes, but their purpose is unchanged. They are still watching, still guarding, and perhaps still waiting for their emperor to rise. The Terracotta Army is one of the few places in the world where the boundary between life and death feels thin, where stone stares back as if it remembers. Walking among them is not like visiting an exhibit. It's like entering a kingdom in pause, a theater where the curtain never rises, but the actors remain frozen in readiness. Archaeologists continue to uncover new figures, new chambers, new secrets. Each layer reveals more of the emperor's vision and more of his fear, because for all his power, Qin Shi Huang could not defeat death. But in building something meant to last forever, he created a legacy that transcended time. The Terracotta Warriors were not meant to be seen, but now that they are, they belong to the world, not just as relics of ancient China, but as reminders of what it means to dream of eternity. They stand not in battle, but in witness to the man who tried to take it all with him. And in a way, perhaps he did. More long before scripts were written or stages constructed, the origins of theater in ancient Greece began in the soil of religion. It wasn't born as entertainment, but as ritual, a sacred offering to the gods, and most of all to Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and ecstatic transformation. To understand theater's beginning, you must picture hillsides, open skies, and communities gathered not for spectacle, but for communion. In the earliest days, people didn't watch performances, they participated in them. Rural festivals held in Dionysus's honor featured drinking, dancing, music, and ecstatic celebration. But at the heart of these gatherings were the dithyrambs, wild, passionate choral hymns sung by groups of 50 men or boys. These were no tame songs. The singers moved in unison, chanting, swaying, invoking the presence of God. It was a ritual meant to transport, to unite mortals with the divine through rhythm, voice, and movement. Over time, these dithyrambic performances grew more structured. The chants began to incorporate storytelling elements, tales of Dionysus' birth, his wanderings, his suffering, and his joy. As the narratives became more complex, one performer began to step out from the chorus. This solo voice would engage in dialogue with the chorus, creating tension, emotion, and the earliest form of dramatic exchange. This innovation is often credited to Thespis of Icaria, a 6th century BCE performer who is said to be the first person to step away from the chorus and assume the role of an individual character. In doing so, Thespis transformed ritual into drama. He didn't just sing about a god, he became the god, or the hero, or the mortal in conflict. From this moment, theater began to emerge from the mist of religious tradition into something distinct, a performed story with characters, emotion, and conflict. But in its earliest form, Greek theater remained inseparable from worship. The stage was a sacred space. The audience was not merely entertained. They were participants in a collective act of reverence, catharsis, and transformation. Theater, in its infancy, was not an art form for fame. It was a mirror held up to the divine, a place where gods spoke through human voices and mortals danced on the edge of mystery. By the 6th century BCE, Athens had begun to grow from a modest city-state into a cultural force, and at the center of its artistic explosion stood the city Dionysia, a festival that would become the cradle of Western drama. Held each spring in honor of Dionysus Eleutherius, this festival blended devotion and spectacle. It lasted several days, and during that time Athens transformed. Streets filled with music, wine flowed freely, and the city paused its usual business. Citizens, foreigners, politicians, and commoners all took part. It was more than a celebration. It was civic unity, where religion, politics, and art converged. Central to Dionysia was the theatrical competition. Tragedians would submit to trilogies, 3 tragedies, and 1 satyr play to be performed in front of a jury. The performances were not casual affairs. They were staged in massive open-air theaters, carved into hillsides with thousands in attendance. The playwrights competed for prestige, but also to honor the god. Winning at Dionysia wasn't just about fame. It was a divine offering. The performances began at dawn and lasted all day. Each trilogy explored themes of human suffering, divine justice, fate and morality. The audience, seated in a semicircular arrangement, watched actors in elaborate masks and robes perform tales of gods, kings, and doomed heroes. These stories were familiar, drawn from myth, but they were told with intensity, designed to move the soul. The chorus remained a vital presence, providing narration, commentary, and emotional resonance. Between scenes, they sang and danced, helping the audience interpret the unfolding drama. Music, movement, and dialogue wove together into something more than a play. It was a sacred experience, a ritual of collective catharsis. Even the state supported these events. The wealthy were required to sponsor productions as a civic duty, and tickets were subsidized so that even the poor could attend. This wasn't just art, it was democracy in motion. The city Dionysia transformed performance into an institution. It gave structure to the chaos of ritual and turned storytelling into a public mirror, one that reflected human weakness, divine wrath, and moral struggle. And through this sacred competition, theater was born. Out of song and ceremony came something darker, deeper, and more enduring tragedy. The word itself, tragedia, means goat song, likely tied to ancient rituals where a goat was sacrificed to Dionysus. But by the 5th century BCE, tragedy had evolved into the cornerstone of Athenian theater, a genre unlike anything the world had seen. Greek tragedy wasn't just a sad story. It was a spiritual dissection, a journey into fate, guilt, honor, and the terrifying uncertainty of divine will. At its heart was a tragic hero, a figure often of noble birth, who struggled against forces greater than himself. He might be a king, a warrior, or even a god-touched mortal, but always he would fall, brought down by a flaw, a decision, or an encounter with the inevitable. What made tragedy powerful wasn't just the fall itself, but the tension between human choice and cosmic fate. These plays forced audiences to ask, are we free or are we doomed? Is suffering random or deserved? And can anyone truly escape the will of the gods? 3 playwrights emerged as the titans of this form: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Aeschylus, the earliest of the 3, added a second actor to the stage, a breakthrough that allowed true dialogue. His works are majestic, solemn, and filled with moral gravity. He saw divine justice as complex, often harsh, but ultimately restoring balance. His Orestia trilogy traces a family cursed by murder, vengeance, and blood, ending only when divine justice replaces personal revenge. Sophocles refined tragedy further, adding a third actor and expanding character depth. His Oedipus Rex remains the quintessential tragedy, a man trying to escape his fate only to run headlong into it. Sophocles painted his characters with more humanity, showing their inner conflict, pride, and helplessness. Euripides, the most controversial, pushed the genre toward realism. His characters were raw, flawed, and unpredictable. He questioned the gods, highlighted the suffering of women and the marginalized, and made tragedy more personal, more painful. Through tragedy, Greek theater became a moral arena, not just a performance, but a confrontation. The audience wasn't entertained. They left shaken, purged, and awed, because tragedy didn't just show the fall of a hero. It revealed the fragility of all human striving and reminded every viewer's suffering is universal and no one is exempt. While tragedy explored the darkness of fate and the weight of the divine, comedy emerged as its irreverent twin, wild, loud, and often scandalous. Where tragedy sought catharsis through suffering, comedy brought release through laughter, a vital counterbalance to the heaviness of Athenian life and ritual. Greek comedy, like tragedy, grew from religious festivals, especially the Dionysia and the Lenaya, another celebration of Dionysus held in winter. In its earliest form, comedy was anarchic and obscene, filled with crude jokes, parodies, and songs that mocked politicians, philosophers, and even the gods. But it wasn't mindless humor. Greek comedy was satirical, sharp-edged, and boldly political. The earliest and most famous playwright of this genre was Aristophanes, a master of what we now call old comedy. His plays featured fantasy, absurdity, and direct attacks on public figures in the clouds. He lampooned Socrates as a foolish sophist. In Lysistrata, he imagined women ending a war by withholding intimacy from their husbands. And in The Frogs, he sent Dionysus himself to the underworld to judge a contest between dead tragedians. Aristophanes plays off and broke the fourth wall. The chorus would turn to the audience and deliver a parabasis, a direct address that blurred the lines between fiction and public discourse. Nothing was off limits. War, corruption, philosophy, and even the theatrical competitions themselves were all fodder for ridicule. But beneath the raunchy humor and surreal plots, Greek comedy served a deeper function. It was a space where society could laugh at itself, speak truth to power, and explore taboo topics in a communal setting. In a democracy like Athens, where public opinion mattered, comedy was a form of release, a collective pressure valve. As Athens changed, so did comedy. Later, in the 4th century BCE, the rise of new comedy introduced more refined, character-driven stories. Playwrights like Menander shifted focus from gods and politics to family, love, and everyday life. These comedies would later influence Roman writers like Plautus and Terence, and eventually the modern sitcom. Greek comedy gave voice to joy, frustration, and rebellion. It showed that in a society grappling with war, death, and destiny, laughter was not escape, but survival. And just as tragedy revealed the human fall, comedy celebrated the human fool, joyful, flawed, and definitely alive. In ancient Greece, the theater was more than a venue. It was a sacred space, both religious and civic, where the community gathered not just to be entertained, but to be transformed. Performances weren't staged in anonymous buildings. They unfolded in massive open-air amphitheaters, carved into the hillsides, always facing nature, the sky above, the sea or city in the distance, and the gods watching from beyond. The most famous of these was the Theater of Dionysus in Athens, located on the southern slope of the Acropolis. It could seat up to 17,000 spectators, citizens, medics, foreign residents, and visitors alike. From its marble tiers, the audience could see and be seen. This mattered. Attending theater was a public act, a civic duty, and a ritual all at once. At the heart of the theater was the orchestra, a circular dancing floor where the chorus would move and sing. Behind it stood the Skene, a building used as a backdrop, dressing area, and symbol of place, palace, temple, or battlefield. The actors performed on a raised platform called the proscenium, and behind them loomed the sacred altar to Dionysus. Every play was performed in his honor. But what truly made the theater sacred wasn't just its structure, it was its purpose. Drama was a communal experience meant to stir the soul, to confront the audience with their fears, beliefs, and responsibilities. As they watched kings fall or fools triumph, the spectators weren't just observers. They were participants in a ritual of catharsis, emotional purification through pity and fear. The festival itself opened with sacrifices and processions. Statues of Dionysus were paraded through the city. The playwrights were not just artists, they were competing priests, offering their stories as sacred acts and the audience. They were witnesses to something divine, unfolding through human voices. This connection between sacred and civic was powerful. Political leaders, generals, and jurors all sat in the front rows. Democracy and drama shared the same stage. In the theater, Athenians faced their myths, their morals, and their mortality together. The Greek theater was never just about actors and applause. It was a temple of the human condition, where every laugh, gasp, and tear was a prayer to the gods of chaos, wisdom, and fate. In the theaters of ancient Greece, where thousands gathered in open air and no microphones existed, how could a single actor command attention? The answer lies in the art of performance. A fusion of mask, movement, and sound that transformed individuals into mythic figures, projecting emotion and character across vast space. At the center of this transformation was the mask. Crafted from lightweight materials like linen, cork, or wood, masks cover the entire face, often with exaggerated expressions. A wide-open mouth for sorrow, an arched brow for rage, a smirk for mischief. Each design amplified the emotional tone of the character. Since only a few actors played multiple roles, the mask also allowed for rapid shifts in identity. One moment a king, the next a god or a slave. Masks weren't just practical, they were sacred tools linking the actor to the spirit of the role. To wear a mask wasn't merely to pretend, it was to embody. The actor became a vessel, channeling not only character, but fate, myth, and message. Costumes were equally important. Robes were brightly colored and stylized, helping define a character's role. Royalty, warrior, servant, or fool. High platform shoes called codhorny elevated tragic actors, lending them a towering otherworldly presence. In contrast, comedic actors wore padded suits and grotesque masks, exaggerating belly, backside, and facial features for laughs. The movement was grand and deliberate. Without close-ups or spoken nuance, actors used sweeping gestures and choreographed steps to express emotion. Every pose mattered. Every turn carried weight. And then there was sound. The chorus, positioned in the orchestra, sang and chanted in unison, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic layer of storytelling. Flutes accompanied the action, enhancing suspense, sorrow, or triumph. The human voice, trained and projected, rang out over the rows of stone seats, resonating through the marble bowl of the theater. Together, mask, costume, motion, and sound formed a ritualized language of performance. It wasn't about realism. It was about essence, distilling human experience into bold, symbolic action. In Greek theater, the actor was not a star, but a servant of the story, shaped by myth, driven by voice, and veiled in the haunting power of the mask. In the heart of every ancient Greek drama stood the chorus, a group that was neither lead actor nor passive audience, but something in between. They did not simply watch the story unfold. They sang it, danced it, questioned it, and mourned it. The chorus was the soul of the performance, a bridge between mortals and gods, stage and spectators. Traditionally composed of 12 to 15 men in tragedy and up to 24 in comedy, the chorus performed in the orchestra, a circular dancing floor at the base of the stage. Their movements were carefully choreographed, and their songs, known as odes or stasima, were set to the tones of the aulos, a double-reeded flute that gave the music its distinct haunting resonance. But what did the chorus do? They offered commentary on the action, posed moral questions, and voiced the thoughts that the characters themselves could not say. If the hero made a fatal choice, the chorus might whisper doubt. If a god intervened, the chorus interpreted its meaning. They echoed the audience's own reactions: fear, pity, outrage, wonder, but with poetry and rhythm that elevated the response into something nearly divine. Sometimes the chorus acted as a kind of collective conscience. In Oedipus Rex, they begged the king to listen to reason, sensing doom before it falls. In Antigone, they struggle to choose between law and justice. In the Bacchae, they represent the ecstatic followers of Dionysus, joyful, dangerous, and devoted. Their function wasn't always solemn. In comedy, the chorus could be loud, rude, and wildly inappropriate. They might interrupt the action, mock the audience, or even deliver a parabasis, a direct address to the crowd, often expressing the playwright's own views on politics, art, or society. What made the chorus powerful wasn't just what they said, but how they said it in unified movement and voice. They were a living metaphor, the many speaking as one, reflecting not just personal opinion, but collective identity. In a world where fate and the gods ruled all, the chorus reminded every theater-goer of their place in the grand design, as witness, as questioner, and as voice for the voiceless. In Athens, the birthplace of both theater and democracy, drama was not just an art form. It was a civic institution. The theater was where the city came together, not only to witness myths and legends, but to confront itself, its values, its fears, its failures. It was a space where storytelling and citizenship intertwined. The annual festivals, especially the city Dionysia, were funded and attended by the state. Wealthy citizens were appointed as chorgoi, responsible for financing productions as a form of public service. The best plays were selected by magistrates, performed in front of thousands, and judged by a panel of citizen jurors. The process was formal, competitive, and deeply Athenian. Why was this important? Because the stories on stage were never just about ancient heroes or faraway gods. They were reflections of the present, moral and political allegories that held a mirror up to the city itself. When Sophocles staged Antigone, he wasn't just telling a myth about a stubborn king. He was asking his fellow Athenians, when does the law serve justice? And when does it become tyranny? When Euripides wrote about war-torn women in the Trojan Women, He was echoing the recent devastation of Athens' own military campaigns. Even comedy got political. Aristophanes lampooned leaders, questioned wars, and ridiculed philosophers. Audiences laughed, but the questions lingered. Who were we following? What are we becoming? Attendance at the theater was not passive. Citizens were expected to go, reflect, and engage. Tickets were often subsidized by the state, so even the poorest Athenians could attend. The belief was clear. A healthy democracy requires a thoughtful public, and theater helped cultivate that thought. Plays did more than entertain. They educated, provoked, united, and challenged. They turned myth into message and stage into statecraft. Every gasp, every cheer, every silence carried civic weight. In a city built on public voice, the theater was its echo chamber, a place where freedom of thought could dance with divine myth, and where every citizen sat not just as spectator, but as participant in the moral life of the polis. Though the golden age of Greek theater faded with the fall of classical Athens, its legacy never disappeared. What began as ritual and evolved into tragedy and comedy would echo across millennia, shaping the very foundation of Western storytelling. After the Peloponnesian War and the rise of Macedon, Athenian theater declined in political power but remained a cultural force. Hellenistic playwrights like Menander shifted the focus from gods and fate to everyday life, romantic entanglements, mistaken identities, and domestic struggles. These new comedies would later influence Roman dramatists, such as Plautus and Terence, whose plays laid the groundwork for Renaissance and modern farce. Roman theater absorbed much from the Greeks, their structure, their characters, even their language. But the deeper influence ran through time. When Shakespeare wrote of tragic heroes brought down by their flaws, or when Molière mocked society through biting wit, the spirit of Sophocles and Aristophanes was alive again, even today. Echoes of ancient Greek drama are everywhere. The three-act structure so common in modern storytelling mirrors the progression of Greek tragedy. The very idea of catharsis, introduced by Aristotle, remains at the heart of powerful narrative, that deep emotional release we feel when a story reflects our own struggles and contradictions. The architecture of modern theaters, the use of masks and performance art, and even the concept of the chorus in musicals all trace their roots to those open-air amphitheaters carved into the hills of ancient Greece. But perhaps the greatest legacy is not found in structure, but in purpose. Greek theater asked questions we are still asking. What is justice? What is faith? What does it mean to be human in a world ruled by forces beyond our control? It gave voice to grief, joy, defiance, and absurdity. It reminded citizens that power must answer to truth, and that laughter could be as revolutionary as rage. What began as songs to a god of wine and ecstasy became a timeless art form, one that continues to illuminate our lives, not with easy answers, but with stories that dare to ask the hardest questions. The stage may have changed, the voices may be new, but the drama, the conflict, the wonder that is eternal. So you've woken up in medieval Europe. You're broke, you're hungry, and your only marketable skill is owning a functioning pair of legs. Congratulations, you're now a solid candidate for life as a petty thief. But let's be clear, nobody wanted to be a thief. It wasn't a rebellious lifestyle choice. No one in the 14th century leaned on a pitchfork and said, when I grow up, I want to steal pies and dodge pitchforks. This wasn't Ocean's 11. This was desperation. Volume 3, with extra mud. The economy was not in your favor. Wages were laughable, assuming you were lucky enough to have a job at all. Most peasants lived hand to mouth, except the mouth was cracked and missing teeth, and the hand was probably frostbitten. If the harvest failed, or your lord decided taxes should now include your last chicken and half your dignity, you either begged or started borrowing things that didn't belong to you permanently. Now you could try honest work, sure, but here's the problem. Honest work in medieval times usually involved backbreaking labor for 14 hours a day, followed by a supper of barley paste and judgment. And even then, your employer might pay you with a potato, handshake, or the promise of good exposure if you work hard enough. Meanwhile, the baker's coin purse looked awfully full and unattended. So yes, people stole. Not because they were criminal masterminds, but because it was often a choice between theft and slow ornamental starvation. But the thing is, it didn't take much to become a criminal. Steal a loaf of bread. That's theft. Pick up an apple that fell off a cart. Theft. Chase a runaway chicken and accidentally enter someone else's garden. Guess what? You're now trespassing and probably guilty of poultry conspiracy. And once you dipped a toe into that muddy legal pond, you were marked. You were now that kind of person. And in a time when gossip moved faster than carts and memory was long, especially for drama, it stuck. So let's say you've committed to the life of theft. You're limber. You're motivated. You've tied a rag around your face to look mysterious. Great. Time to find a target. Except good luck with that. You see, the biggest problem with being a medieval thief, other than a constant risk of hanging, is that nobody had anything worth stealing. Most villagers were poor and couldn't afford new shoes. More like this potato is both dinner and pillow poor. The average peasant owned maybe one pair of trousers, 2 spoons, and a goat named after a family member. Their homes were made of mud, sticks, and optimism. They didn't have jewelry. They didn't have coin purses. Some of them didn't even have purses. They just tied things into bits of cloth and hoped for the best. You might get excited seeing someone in the market with a bulging pouch, only to find it's full of turnip seeds and a dead mouse. Congratulations. You've just risked your life for ingredients and rodent protein. You think nobles were better targets. They had gold, after all. But they also had guards, dogs, fortresses, and an unhealthy enthusiasm for punishing people who touched their hats the wrong way. Robbing a noble was like walking into a wasp nest with a torch and hoping the wasps were polite. Then there were the clergy. Churches had chalices and silver crosses, yes, but also locked doors, divine judgment, and more importantly, town gossip. Steal from the church and everyone knew by lunch. Also, you might get cursed. Even if you didn't believe in curses, it still ruined your week. And don't even think about grave robbing. First of all, medieval cemeteries weren't exactly Fort Knox. They were barely organized. You could spend half the night digging, only to find a pile of rocks and a very annoyed mole. Pause. Exhuming bodies meant people assumed you were into dark magic, which came with additional problems. Being a thief in medieval Europe required a certain level of stealth, moving quietly through the shadows, slipping past sleeping guards, vanishing into the mist like a mysterious, misunderstood anti-hero. That was the dream. The reality? You smelled like a bag of boiled onions left in a goat's sock. Hygiene wasn't exactly a medieval priority. Baths were rare, soap was expensive, and deodorant hadn't been invented yet, unless you counted stuffing your shirt with dried herbs and hoping people mistook you for a mobile salad. And thieves? They weren't exactly living in comfort. Most slept in haystacks, alleys, or under pigs. You absorbed the environment, not in a poetic way, in a way your body is now 30% barnyard. So when you crept up behind someone in the marketplace, they usually heard you coming. Not by sound, by sin. You might as well have worn a sign that said, "I have not seen clean water since Lent." Your clothing didn't help. Most thieves wore the same outfit every day because it was the only one they owned. After a few nights of hiding in chimneys or crouching behind fish stalls, that outfit developed a personality, the kind of personality that clears a room even worse. Your job requires physical activity. Running, jumping, crouching, all in heavy woolen clothes that trapped every molecule of body odor like a cursed sponge. You were a walking scent crime. Guards didn't need dogs to track you. They just followed the faint trail of sweat, mold, and bad life choices. Did you hear that? No, but I smelled it. Not exactly the mystique most thieves hoped for. And if you thought you could blend into a crowd to escape, think again. Medieval crowds were full of people who also had bathed. Yes, but you were worse. Somehow, you stood out. You were the human equivalent of a warning. It's hard to be invisible when everyone around you is quietly gagging and opening windows. Dogs, man's best friend. Unless, of course, you were a medieval thief, in which case dogs were traitorous, furry snitches with teeth. Every village, farmstead, and roadside tavern had one. Not the floppy-eared, tail-wagging, who's a good boy kind we know today. No, these were wiry, half-feral creatures with scars, names like Chopper or Bitey, and the temper of a drunk blacksmith with gout. You didn't pet them. You prayed they didn't detect your presence through the fog to a thief. Dogs were the worst kind of security system. Cheap, loyal, and prone to dramatic barking at everything. It didn't matter how quiet you were. Step on a twig. Bark. Sneeze into your sleeve. Bark. Breathe slightly near the pantry door. You'd better believe in bark. And now the entire street knows you're trying to liberate that wheel of cheese. And they weren't just noisy. They were fast. Dogs could cross muddy courtyards in seconds. Meanwhile, you're slipping on cabbage leaves and tripping over buckets. Suddenly, the quick job turns into a frantic race between your questionable cardio and a set of yellowed fangs. Getting bitten wasn't even the worst part. The real issue. Once a dog hated you, and they always did. It will never be forgotten. Medieval dogs had memories like grudge-holding grandparents. You could rob a bakery once in spring, and 3 months later, that same dog would be waiting for you outside the alehouse, ready for round two. Even worse, the townspeople loved their dogs more than their relatives. If a guard dog barked at you, people didn't ask questions. Oh, Bitey's barking. Must be a thief. Grab a pitchfork and tell a priest to prep the confession chair. You couldn't bribe them, reason with them, or outrun them forever. They didn't care if you were just trying to swipe a loaf of bread for your starving sibling. As far as they were concerned, you were an intruder, and your legs were made of chew toys. Here's the ironic thing. Most medieval homes didn't have locks. Not because people were trusting, but because locks were expensive, complex, and usually reserved for things like monasteries, city gates, or chests that definitely contained 3 rusty spoons and a saint's toenail. So you might think, perfect, easy pickings for me. The nimble village sneak thief. Not quite, because while locks were rare, traps were not. People couldn't afford keys, so they got creative. And by creative, I mean actively hostile. It began with the door itself. Most weren't doors so much as wooden slabs that creaked like tortured souls and groaned when touched. Try opening one quietly, and you trigger an audio alarm louder than a cathedral bell. And that was the easy part. Many villagers hung crude bells on strings just inside. A medieval motion detector, if you will. Pull the door. Jingle, jangle. The entire household is awake. Baby crying, dog barking, someone screaming. Get the pitchfork. You've lost the element of surprise and possibly a finger. Then there were the improvised defenses. Some people leaned buckets of water above the door. Others scattered dry twigs across the floor, so any sneaky step would crunch like you were stepping on a bowl of angry granola. And in rural areas, traps involved sharp farm tools, low-hanging beams, or, in one recorded case, a welcome mat made of hedgehogs. Let's not forget the poultry alarm system chickens. You think they'd be neutral. But no. Medieval chickens were nervous, shrieking nightmares that exploded into chaos the moment they sensed movement. One flap, and suddenly the courtyard sounds like a demon choir. And if you ever made it past the door, congratulations. You now meet the family goose. Geese with the unholy fusion of burglar, alarm, bouncer, and emotional terrorist. They didn't just honk. They charged fast, with beaks, and they held grudges. In short, the lack of a lock didn't mean welcome. It meant go ahead, try it. We dare you. Every peasant was a part-time security expert, not because they were paranoid, but because they had stuff worth protecting and no spare spoons. Let's say you've somehow evaded the angry dog, the suspicious goose, and the door that shrieked like a ghost on fire. You're inside. Success. Now you just have to sneak past the sleeping family and nab a pouch of coins. Except bad news. Nobody was really asleep in medieval times. People didn't sleep in blissful, silent REM cycles. They slept like anxious squirrels, half-conscious, one ear open, and usually holding something sharp. You see, being alive in the Middle Ages was a contact sport. Bandits, plague, taxes, wild boars. It was a daily buffet of potential doom. So when people went to bed, they didn't do it peacefully. They slept in shifts with one eye cracked open and their favorite stabbing implement close at hand. And we're not talking about swords or dramatic daggers. We're talking about fireplace pokers, pitchforks, ladles that doubled as skull crackers, and the occasional suspiciously sharpened spoon if it could dent your forehead. It was bedtime ready. Even peasants with families didn't trust the darkness. Parents slept with their kids, huddled close, not out of love, but because it was easier to defend them all from one centralized pile. You know, like human Tetris, but angry. And don't assume there was a guest room to tiptoe past. Medieval houses were basically one big room. Beds, if you were lucky. Otherwise, straw mats and a goat that snored. You could barely walk without stepping on someone's cousin or a butter churn. You weren't sneaking. You were dodging obstacles like a medieval ninja warrior contestant. Oh, and let's not forget the soundscape. Every house had creaky floors, sputtering firelight, and that one sleeper who definitely talked in their sleep. More than one thief was caught mid-heist when someone suddenly shouted, "You stole my pies." In a dream, and everyone bolted upright. The truth is, no one truly slept deeply in medieval times. They just powered down enough to survive and restart the next miserable day. And if a floorboard creaked at the wrong hour, that wasn't a noise. That was an invitation to attack something. Getting caught as a medieval thief wasn't just a bad day. It was a permanent lifestyle change. And not in the way you learned your lesson. More like they burn a letter into your face, and now even the village goats judge you. Yes, branding was real, and not the cool kind where you build a personal aesthetic and Instagram following. No, this was actual red-hot iron pressed into your flesh, courtesy of the local constable with all the bedside manner of a bear trap. Steal once, and you'd be marked for life, usually with a T for thief, a V for vagabond, or sometimes just a nice sizzling stripe across your forehead because creativity was limited but cruelty was abundant. The point wasn't justice, it was visibility. The medieval justice system believed shame should be portable. That way everyone knew what you'd done, even if you weren't currently doing it. Think of it like wearing a name tag that says, "Hi, I steal things only written in scar tissue and judgment." And once you were branded, good luck with everything. Want a job? No. Want a room at the inn? Absolutely not. Want to buy a carrot without the vendor nervously checking their inventory? Think again. Even worse, the branding process wasn't always done by professionals. Sometimes it was the local blacksmith after a few Alish. Sometimes it was a priest who swore he read about it in a book once. The results varied. Sometimes it looked like a letter. Sometimes it looked like your face had lost a wrestling match with a fireplace, and heaven help you if you got caught a second time. Because now they had to get creative, branding in new places, chopping fingers, shaving half your head. Which, by the way, was apparently the medieval equivalent of a social media takedown. In theory, medieval justice had a system. In practice, that system often looked like 20 angry villagers, one slippery accusation, and a hayfork with opinions. Welcome to trial by mob. The go-to-legal process for thieves who were caught red-handed, red-faced, or just unlucky enough to look suspicious near someone else's pie. See, if a medieval crowd believed you stole something, they didn't call a lawyer. They called everyone else. Neighbors, shopkeepers, children with no context but lots of enthusiasm. Suddenly, you weren't in trouble with the authorities. You were in trouble with Marjorie, who remembers when you looked funny at her geese 2 months ago, and once the mob had gathered, forget innocent until proven guilty. That idea was about 500 years of one enlightenment away. You were guilty the moment someone shouted. That's him. Bonus guilt if your clothes were torn, your hair was wild, or you didn't live within shouting distance. Your trial usually began with yelling, escalated to grabbing, and ended with something being thrown at your head. Possibly a shoe. Possibly a turnip. Possibly a goat. Medieval mobs were unpredictable, but deeply committed. If you were lucky, someone with an official title showed up. A constable, maybe a monk if you were really blessed. But often you were at the mercy of local justice, which meant you'd be tied to a post in the square while everyone took turns describing how their day had been ruined, specifically because of you. The evidence? Circumstantial. The verdict was decided by volume. The sentence is creative. Sometimes it was public shaming, stocks, pillories, or being forced to wear a sign that said something like "I steal eggs and lie to my aunt." Sometimes it was a beating. Sometimes it was being dunked in a river while people yelled things like "confess," and I told you he looked like a sock thief. Appeals. None. Defense. You could try shouting. It wasn't me, but that mostly made people throw harder. Mob justice didn't aim for truth. It aimed for closure. Fast, loud, cathartic closure. You've been caught. The mobs had their fun. Maybe they didn't kill you. Congratulations. You've been deemed worthy of public humiliation instead. Enter the stocks now. If you're imagining a quiet time out to reflect on your choices, no. Stocks weren't punishment-like. They were medieval entertainment. You were the show, and not a good one. More like a local improv group made entirely of humiliation and leg cramps. First, let's define them. Stocks were large wooden frames that locked your ankles and sometimes your wrists into place. You sat awkwardly in a public square, hunched like a badly folded deck chair, with your limbs stretched out and your dignity leaking from every pore. And you stayed there for hours, sometimes days. Rain, tough, snow, too bad. Pigeons landing on your head. Welcome to your new normal. But the weather wasn't the worst part. The people were. Passers-by were encouraged to mock you loudly, creatively. They'd throw things. Spoiled food, manure, whatever was nearby and unpleasant. Children especially enjoyed this. It was a community bonding moment, like a holiday, but smellier and more personal. "Hey, that's the guy who stole the blacksmith sausage," someone would shout. Then the sausage, now very stale, would be hurled directly at your face. And don't think you could tune it out. Stocks were deliberately uncomfortable. Your legs went numb, your back ached, and your nose ran while villagers composed folk songs about your criminal incompetence. You might get lucky and have a sympathetic friend sneak you some bread. More likely, though, someone stole your food while mocking your theft record. That's irony, medieval style. And let's not forget the long-term effects. After a public stock session, you were marked not physically, but socially. People remembered you were now. That guy from the stocks. It stuck longer than the cabbage in your hair. Also, if you thought this was the lowest tier of punishment, think again. The stocks were practically a spa day compared to what came next. Branding, mutilation, or a one-way ticket to the gallows courtesy of your local execution enthusiast. By medieval standards, a flogging was considered merciful, not because it was painless, far from it, but because it meant you still had your limbs, your life, and a chance to limp home afterward in a world where punishment often included branding, dismemberment, or the kind of community engagement that ended with a funeral. A good old-fashioned flogging was almost polite. Let's set the scene. You've been caught stealing, perhaps a loaf of bread or someone's spare boots. You're hauled into the town square, surrounded by people who definitely don't have anything better to do, and the local authority gives the nod. Out comes the whip, not the movie-style leather one. This is more of a rough rope or a strip of knotted hide wielded by someone who's either very enthusiastic or just having a bad day. You're tied to a post, always a public spot, so the town gets a free show. You might be shirtless, but only because torn clothes aren't great protection. There's no dramatic music, just the sound of rope hitting skin and someone in the crowd saying something that serves him right. I always suspected he looked like a bread thief. The goal wasn't just pain, it was deterrence. You weren't just being punished, you were being used as a living lesson. Steal, and this could be you, the lash said over and over again, like a very violent, motivational speaker. The lash count varied. 51020, depending on the crime, the mood of the judge, or whether the person administering it had a sore shoulder that day. And if you passed out mid-punishment, that was fine. They'd just pause, splash water on your face, and continue. Hydration was important after all. But here's the thing. If you were flogged, it meant someone had decided not to go further. You weren't locked away forever. You weren't branded or worse. You were punished, yes, but then you were released, bruised, embarrassed, but alive. So you've just swiped a purse, maybe nabbed a wedge of cheese. Excellent. You're on the run. Now what? Well, unless you had a flawlessly timed horse waiting behind the tannery. And let's be honest, you didn't. Your getaway looked a lot more like awkward power walking through mud while villagers shouted, "Stop, thief." And someone's grandmother tried to trip you with a broom. Medieval towns weren't exactly built for clean escapes. Streets were narrow, twisted, and usually clogged with carts, pigs, or someone arguing loudly with a monk. Cobblestones were uneven, and if it had rained recently, and it always had, you were ankle deep in a mystery stew of mud, straw, and regret in footwear. Don't get your hopes up. You were probably wearing worn-out leather shoes tied together with string. Or worse, you were barefoot. Running away from an angry butcher while your feet are actively bleeding is a deeply humbling experience. You might think I'll duck into an alley. Great. Except most alleys weren't alleys. They were dead ends. Or worse, communal latrines. Many a daring escape was cut tragically short by an unexpected wall, or a waist-high pile of something best left unnamed. Even if you made it out of the village, the countryside wasn't your friend either. Open fields left you exposed, and forests were full of people exactly like you, who would absolutely rob you the moment you stumbled in with a stolen pie and a limp. It's hard to enjoy the fruits of crime when another criminal is eyeing your fruit. And let's not forget the locals. They didn't sit back and say, "Oh, we'll let the guards handle it." No, chasing thieves was a team sport. Farmers, merchants, children, that one guy who just really liked shouting. All of them would join the pursuit, and they weren't chasing you out of civic duty. They just wanted to be part of something. So you made it through the mud, dodged the pitchforks, and maybe even kept the stolen sausage. Time to lie low and regroup. But here's the twist. Medieval criminals weren't a merry band of lovable rogues. They were a grim collection of opportunists, outcasts, and people who would absolutely steal your socks while helping you hide. See, the term organized crime was a little optimistic in medieval Europe. Thieves didn't form elegant guilds or meet in candle-lit taverns to discuss codes of honor. They squatted in ruined buildings, fought over crumbs, and turned each other in for half a crust of bread and a pat on the head from the local sheriff. These were not your allies. They were your competition. The more desperate the times, the more dangerous the thieves. You weren't rubbing elbows with Robin Hood. You were huddled next to someone named Rancid Thomas, who once bit a guy over a turnip. And Thomas, he'd sell you out in a heartbeat and then sell your shoes a minute later. Trust was a luxury, and loyalty came second to self-preservation. If you had a safe hideout, someone would find it and borrow everything. If you had food, you were suddenly everyone's best friend until you fell asleep. Even worse, these people drew attention. The kind you didn't want. Drunken brawls in the street, shouting about stolen spoons, getting caught and naming every person they'd ever met, including you and your cousin and probably your goat. It was a circus, badly run one. And if you dared to rise above, to be, say, a thief with a code, you'd still end up lumped in with the worst of them. To the townsfolk, a thief was a thief. It didn't matter if you only stole to survive while others robbed churches and insulted chickens. In the public eye, you were all part of the same smelly, morally bankrupt pie. You might imagine that getting caught meant going to prison, a medieval stone dungeon with iron bars, straw beds, and a tragic roommate named Gareth. Maybe you picture rats, some slow redemption arc, and someone slipping you bread through a slot in the door. Wrong. Medieval prisons weren't punishment. They were holding pens, glorified broom closets for people waiting to be publicly shamed, fined, or if your week was going really badly, executed. If you were lucky enough to land in a prison. And that's a sentence we never thought we'd say. It was less institution and more wet hole in the ground. Literally. Many jails were dug into the earth beneath castles, town halls, or someone's spare barn. Ventilation. Optional. Sanitation. Non-existent. You weren't doing time. You were doing mildew. Forget privacy. You were tossed into a shared pit with whoever else had annoyed the authorities that week. Drunkards, arsonists, suspicious-looking peasants, a guy who accidentally insulted the bishop's horse. All of you packed together like sad, damp sardines. Beds? No. Blankets? Also no. Food? Only if someone felt charitable. Or if your family could bribe the guard with coins, favors, or a particularly fine turnip. Otherwise, you lived off scraps, rainwater, and your own terrible life choices. And then came the boredom. No trials, no schedules. Just sitting, waiting, smelling things that could legally be classified as weapons. Sometimes you wait for a trial. Other times you waited for someone important to remember you were there. Of course, not everyone got a prison cell. If your crime was bad enough, or if the jail was full, you were just chained up outside in the rain on display. It was a great opportunity for passing strangers to comment on your moral failings while throwing cabbage. You might think, well, at least I'm not dead. And sure, technically that's a win. But after a week ankle deep in your own regret, even the town gallows started to feel like an early release program. If you were a medieval thief who finally ran out of luck, or chickens to blame, the end of the line often involved rope, a wooden platform, and a very public calendar event known as Market Day Execution. Yes, the gallows had a schedule. These things were planned. You weren't just quietly removed in a night. No. Your final performance was community experience. Children were brought along. Vendors sold snacks. If you were particularly infamous, someone might write a rude little ballad about you, the medieval version of going viral. And the worst part, they usually made you wait. You might be told on Monday you're being hanged on Friday, so you had the joy of stewing in fear while listening to the guards practice jokes about your last words. By the time Friday rolled around, the whole town had gathered. Not because they hated you personally, though some definitely did, but because executions were a thing. Public punishment was the medieval version of reality TV. Everyone came for the drama, the spectacle, and possibly a roast chicken. Now the gallows themselves were fairly straightforward. A wooden structure, a rope, and a platform that dropped out from under your feet. The key detail: efficiency. It wasn't about ceremony. It was about getting it done and moving on with the day. You didn't get a final meal. You didn't get last words unless the executioner was in a generous mood or needed a bathroom break. If you were lucky, the rope was tied correctly, and your neck snapped instantly. If you were unlucky, and let's be honest, you were a medieval thief, so luck wasn't your strong suit. The rope stretched, and things got awkward. And just in case you thought people would forget about you, they didn't. Your body might be left hanging for hours, sometimes days, as a reminder, like a gruesome billboard that said shoplifting is not recommended occasionally. A well-meaning cleric might offer last rites. Occasionally a local artist would sketch the whole thing in disturbing detail. But mostly it was just you, gravity, and a town full of people whispering that's the guy who stole 3 onions. So let's say somehow you managed to avoid the dogs, the stocks, the branding iron, the gallows, and every angry goose between here and the city gates. You survived. You even pulled off a few decent hauls. A coin pouch here. A roast duck there. Congratulations. You're what passes for a successful medieval thief. Now what? Retirement. Oh, sweet summer peasant. Retirement was not a thing. There was no pension plan. No seaside cottage to write your memoirs. No peaceful sunset years surrounded by grandchildren asking how you once escaped a bishop's pantry. If you were lucky, you lived long enough to become too slow to steal and too grizzled to be worth arresting. That just meant you graduated to begging, the medieval version of consulting. And even that wasn't easy. Cities had official beggar permits. No, really. If you didn't have one, you were just a criminal with fewer cardio skills. Begging without a license could get you kicked out of town or into a ditch. Some thieves try to go straight, maybe become a laborer. Problem is, you're still branded, still infamous, and still missing 3 teeth and a solid resume. When your references include escaping a cellar once and knowing how to climb a wall in under 30 seconds, employers tend to look elsewhere. And let's not forget the other charming option, becoming an informant. You turn your old friends for a few coins and a pat on the back until someone recognizes you, and then you become the story of the week at the local gallows. So no, there was no retirement plan, no thieves union, no quiet fade into obscurity. Your options were to keep stealing until you're caught. Try begging and still possibly get caught. Join a mercenary band and probably get stabbed by someone worse than you. Disappear into the forest and become folklore, preferably the mysterious thief who vanished after one last job, though more likely a guy who died in a puddle near a bush. So when people say crime doesn't pay in the medieval world, they weren't joking. It paid in bruises, scars, and a lifetime of looking over your shoulder. It started with good intentions, or at least that's what the official reports claimed. In the early 1800s, Britain was being swallowed whole by industrialization. Cities like London and Manchester were bursting at the seams, overflowing with factory smoke, horse dung, and something society feared far more than poverty: madness. The old model of dealing with the mentally ill, chaining them in private madhouses, locking them in poor houses, or hiding them behind closed doors was no longer enough. Reformers like the Quaker William Tuke in York had already begun to experiment with something radical. His moral treatment model rejected whips and beatings in favor of gardens, fresh air, and human decency. For a moment, it looked like the dawn of a more humane age. But progress has a way of turning sour. The 1808 County Asylums Act changed everything. It allowed local governments across England and Wales to build public asylums funded by taxes. And that's exactly what they did by the dozen. By mid-century, asylums had become sprawling institutions on the edge of every major town. Their architecture was Gothic, ominous, and fortress-like. They were supposed to be temples of healing. Instead, they became warehouses for the unwanted. The problem wasn't the concept, it was the execution. These new public asylums weren't just for the violently insane. They became dumping grounds for the inconvenient. Unmarried mothers, alcoholics, epileptics, paupers, menopausal women. Anyone who caused a scene or failed to follow Victorian norms could end up inside. Diagnoses were vague, often sexist, and deeply moralistic. If you were a woman with opinions, you might be labeled hysterical. If you were a man who didn't work hard enough, you might be accused of melancholia or moral insanity. And once you were inside, it was hard to get out. Asylums ballooned in size. What began as institutions for 50 or 60 patients swelled to house thousands. Overcrowding exploded. Funding couldn't keep up. The staff-to-patient ratio collapsed. Moral treatment gave way to containment. Straitjackets replaced guards. Cold baths replaced conversation. In theory, Victorian asylums were a beacon of scientific progress. In practice, they became the padded cells where progress was left to rot. And this was only the beginning. So what made someone mad in the Victorian era? That depended less on science and more on your social status, gender, and whether your neighbors thought you were a bit odd. Diagnoses in the 19th century were a cocktail of superstition, pseudoscience, and moral judgment. Shaken, not stirred. Medical professionals, known as alienists, had enormous power and shockingly little evidence. They worked from thick manuals listing supposed causes of insanity that included everything from overwork and religious fervor to masturbation and reading novels. Yes, reading novels, especially if you are a woman. Victorian doctors were obsessed with female hysteria, a condition so poorly defined it became a catch-all diagnosis for anything deemed emotionally inconvenient mood swings. Sexual desire, defiance, grief, a widow who cried too long, hysterical. A woman who resisted her husband's advances, hysterical. An unmarried woman past 30, definitely hysterical. Men, too, weren't safe from moral judgment disguised as medicine. Alcoholism, idleness, self-abuse, or simply being melancholic could all earn a one-way ticket to the asylum. The diagnosis of moral insanity became especially popular. It described those who behaved badly without appearing outwardly delusional. In other words, the Victorian way of saying we don't like this guy. Once committed, often by a family member or a local magistrate, the patient was trapped in a system that offered few checks and balances. The legal requirement for commitment? 2 medical certificates. That's it. No court trial, no patient consent, no appeal. There were even cases of women committed by husbands for questioning their authority, or disturbingly, to get rid of them entirely. Divorce was scandalous and expensive. The asylum was cheaper. Inside, the patient's diagnosis dictated everything: their meals, their cell or room, if they were lucky, and even whether they could speak or be spoken to. Those labeled excitable might be kept in silence. The violent were confined to locked rooms. If you were rich or well-connected, you might get a private cell with a window. If not, you shared your cell with dozens of rats. To the Victorian medical mind, insanity was often rooted in weakness, moral, spiritual, or sexual. Cures were unlikely. Control was the goal, and so the line between madness and inconvenience blurred. Diagnosis became a tool of social discipline, more about conformity than care. And as we'll soon see, the treatment was often worse than the disease. Once you were labeled insane and locked away, the next step was treatment. But in Victorian mental asylums, that word didn't mean what you think it means. Forget therapy sessions or medication. Treatment was often just a sanitized term for discipline or punishment disguised as medicine. Early on, some asylums clung to the ideal of moral therapy, which emphasized calm environments, routine, fresh air, and kindness. But as patient numbers exploded and funding shrank, doctors turned to faster, more forceful methods. Cold water immersion was a favorite. Patients were plunged into ice baths, not to refresh them, but to shock their nervous system into submission. Some were kept in tubs for hours, strapped down, trembling and silent. The theory that madness could be cooled off. The reality? Hypothermia, trauma, and despair. Another popular technique was the tranquilizer chair, a sinister device invented by Dr. Benjamin Rush. Patients were strapped in, often blindfolded, with their limbs restrained and sometimes a box placed over their heads to block out sound. This was meant to calm the senses. In practice, it was solitary confinement with extra humiliation. Electricity soon entered the mix. Before modern electroconvulsive therapy, Victorians experimented with rudimentary electrical devices, crude and often dangerous. Patients were zapped in an attempt to stimulate dormant brain areas or restore sanity. In reality, it mostly left them frightened, burned, or worse. Bleeding and purging were still in use too. Holdovers from medieval medicine. Doctors believed an imbalance in bodily fluids caused madness. So out came the leeches and laxatives. Some even drilled holes into patients' skulls to release pressure, a procedure with roots in ancient trepanation and about the same success rate zero. For women, treatments often had a deeply sexist edge. Hysteria might be treated with enforced celibacy, genital surgeries, or if the doctor was particularly depraved, manual stimulation, which gave rise to the invention of the vibrator. Yes, the first vibrators were medical devices designed by Victorian doctors who thought female orgasms cure insanity. And then there was sedation. Chloral hydrate and opiates were used liberally, not to heal, but to silence. Patients were rendered docile, zombie-like, easy to manage, especially in overcrowded asylums with one nurse for every 50 inmates. Victorian asylums didn't heal minds. They broke them systematically, coldly, and often with the approval of the medical establishment. And still, somehow it would get worse. If you were to approach a Victorian mental asylum from the outside, it might look majestic. Grand stone facades, manicured gardens, sweeping driveways. But don't be fooled. These buildings were designed less for healing and more for containment. The architecture of the Victorian asylum was deeply symbolic. It reflected the era's obsession with order, hierarchy, and surveillance. Many institutions followed a rigid design known as the corridor plan or the pavilion system, a layout that allowed patients to be strictly segregated by gender, diagnosis, or behavior. Women on one wing, men on the other. Quiet patients near the center, noisy or violent ones pushed to the edges. The asylum was a fortress of discipline. Windows were high and narrow, doors locked from the outside, hallways echoed with every footstep, amplifying even the smallest sounds. Furniture was bolted to the floors. The beds were iron-framed and thin. There were no personal items, no privacy, and certainly no warmth. Every detail of the structure screamed, "You are not free." At the center of many institutions stood the superintendent's office, always with a view of the wards, a constant reminder that you were being watched. Think of it as a psychological panopticon. You never knew exactly when you were under observation, which meant you always behaved as if you were. Even the landscaping played a role. Gardens weren't just for aesthetics. They were tools of pacification. Patients were expected to work in them, pruning hedges and hauling soil as part of their moral rehabilitation. It was unpaid labor designed to keep them busy and tired. Then came the airing courts, walled outdoor enclosures where patients were marched for fresh. These weren't spaces of leisure. They were more like outdoor cells. Men and women walked in circles under the gaze of attendants. Talking was discouraged. Laughter was suspicious. Inside the asylum, the rules were suffocating. You needed permission to speak, to sit, to stand, even to use the toilet. Infractions were met with punishment, isolation, restraints, or worse. Even hope became dangerous. Grandiose delusions could include thinking you'd ever leave. The Victorian Asylum was a machine, a cold, efficient mechanism designed to categorize, restrain, and forget those deemed unfit for the world outside. And once the door closed behind you, it often stayed that way for life. If you were a woman in Victorian Britain, the asylum loomed like a silent threat behind every social misstep. The 19th century was a golden age for patriarchy. Women were expected to be docile, obedient, and quietly miserable. Anything outside that narrow ideal, too loud, too sexual, too sad, too clever, could be interpreted as madness. And the asylum was always hiring. Husbands could commit their wives with frightening ease. All it took were 2 medical signatures, no trial, no defense, no requirement for evidence. In one infamous case, a woman was institutionalized for having religious excitement after attending too many church services. In another, a wife was locked up for arguing about money. But not all cases were so benignly absurd. Some were horrifying. Women who had experienced trauma, sexual abuse, postpartum depression, or miscarriages were often accused of hysteria. Rather than being given support, they were locked away, subjected to invasive cures and left to rot in understaffed wards. Victorian medicine didn't treat their pain. It pathologized it. Even menopause was suspect. Doctors labeled it a dangerous time for female mental instability. Mood swings, hot flashes, and irritability were treated not as natural processes, but as signs of climacteric insanity. Translation: middle-aged women had lost their minds and must be restrained. Teenage girls didn't fare better. A rebellious daughter, too flirtatious or too bookish, might be sent to an asylum for her own good. Once inside, her youth and vulnerability made her especially susceptible to abuse from both staff and other patients, and she might never leave. Sexuality was perhaps the most common justification for locking women away. The Victorian era was obsessed with female chastity, and any deviation from this ideal, real or imagined, was grounds for medicalized confinement. Masturbation, infidelity, even excessive romantic imagination were treated as symptoms of madness. Treatment methods often doubled as sexual control. Doctors performed clitoridectomies and other surgeries, claiming they cured hysteria or nymphomania. In reality, they were acts of violence designed to erase pleasure and enforce submission. The asylum became a tool of social control, especially for women, a place where inconvenient wives, curious daughters, and grieving mothers could be removed, silenced, and forgotten. The walls didn't just contain madness. They institutionalized misogyny, and no one on the outside dared ask too many questions. When we picture Victorian asylums, we often imagine adults pacing the corridors in nightgowns, whispering to themselves or staring out barred windows. But many of the most overlooked victims were at both ends of life's timeline, the very young and the very old. Children were not spared the asylum's reach. Victorian society didn't fully recognize childhood as a distinct psychological stage. A child who was too unruly, slow to learn, or showed signs of neurological disorders like epilepsy or autism was often labeled idiotic or feeble-minded. There was little understanding and even less compassion. Entire wings of asylums, and later separate institutions called idiot asylums, were built to house these children. Their treatments were basic at best, abusive at worst. Many were left to rot in corners or restrained for hours. Education was limited to repetitive tasks, if offered at all. Some were sterilized in the name of eugenics. And because their families were ashamed or too poor to care for them, many children spent their entire lives behind asylum walls. Then there were the elderly, especially those suffering from what we now recognize as dementia, Parkinson's, or age-related psychosis. Back then, these conditions were lumped together under terms like senile insanity. The elderly poor in particular had few options. If they were alone, confused, or simply couldn't manage their lives, the asylum beckoned. Victorian workhouses were often the first stop, brutal institutions designed to punish poverty. But when an older person began to show signs of mental deterioration, the workhouse would pass them along to the asylum system. There they were locked away with little hope of release or specialized care, inmates too young to understand, or too old to resist shared. Overcrowded dormitories endured the same regimens and were often forgotten entirely. Lacking advocates, these groups suffered in silence. No letters, no visitors, no voice. And because they weren't violent or disruptive, they were often ignored by the staff. Just another warm body to sedate, bathe, and feed. These patients weren't treated as individuals. They were considered burdens, mouths to feed in a system already stretched to its breaking point. In many asylums, children died of neglect, elderly patients died of exposure, and no one kept proper records. In a world obsessed with order and morality, youth and age were just two more ways to fall short and two more reasons to be locked away. Not everyone turned a blind eye to the horrors inside the asylum walls by the mid to late 19th century. Cracks had begun to show in the public image of mental institutions. Scandals leaked out. Patients were found dead under suspicious circumstances. Whistleblowers began to speak up, and reformers seized the moment. One of the earliest and most vocal advocates for change was Dorothea Dix, an American activist who toured British institutions and was appalled by what she saw. She wasn't alone in England. Figures like Louisa Lowe and John Percival, the son of a British prime minister who had himself been institutionalized, began publishing pamphlets and testimonies that exposed abuse, false imprisonments, and unspeakable living conditions. These accounts were damning patients chained for weeks, women sedated to silence their cries of protest, sanitary conditions that rivaled those of prisons, or worse, some institutions like Hanwell or Coney Hatch became infamous for their sheer scale and brutality. In 1859, Parliament passed the Lunacy Act, which attempted to standardize asylum regulations. A board of commissioners in lunacy was formed to inspect institutions and protect patient rights. But in practice, inspections were sporadic and superficial. Superintendents had time to tidy things up before visits, and abuse continued in quieter corners. Meanwhile, journalists began sniffing around. Undercover investigations revealed that many patients weren't mad at all. They were poor, difficult, inconvenient, or victims of family betrayals. The newspapers ate it up. Public outrage simmered. Reform-minded doctors, too, began to question the system. Some experimented with occupational therapy, music, and recreation. They called for better training for attendants and higher standards of care. A few institutions even introduced open wards where patients were not locked inside and could roam the grounds, a revolutionary idea at the time. But these improvements were uneven at best. For every progressive asylum, there were 10 where nothing changed. Why? Because the system was profitable. Families could pay to have a relative quietly removed. Local governments saved face by hiding the visibly unwell. And the public preferred the illusion of care to the discomfort of reality. The reformers made noise, yes, but the machine kept humming. And while some patients found their voices and champions, most remained locked away, quiet, forgotten, and increasingly hopeless. The age of reform had begun, but it was far from finished. In Victorian society, madness wasn't just feared. It was ironically seen as an asylum. Were not always hidden from public view. In fact, they often became local attractions. Visitors, curious, bored, or just plain morbid, could buy tickets to tour the wards. It was part spectacle, part moral instruction. Look how fortunate you are not to be like them. This wasn't an exaggeration. Middle and upper class Victorians treated asylum visits like museum outings. Families would pack lunch, ride their carriages to the local lunatic hospital, and stroll past the barred windows and padded cells like they were viewing zoo animals. Sometimes attendants would point out particularly entertaining patients, those who raved, danced, or shouted at the walls. It was theater, but the cast never auditioned. Even the patients were aware of it. Some wrote letters begging to be spared the humiliation of being on display. Others performed madness, believing that acting insane enough might secure a release, or at least some attention. But the spectacle went beyond voyeurism. The asylum also became a tool of political theater. Doctors gave public lectures inside their institutions, showcasing their success stories and methods. Patients were trotted out like trophies, often still suffering, but coached to say they were improving. These exhibitions reassured donors and officials that their money wasn't being wasted. Photography played its part too. The Victorian era saw the birth of psychiatric portraiture. Solemn, eerie images of patients posed stiffly, sometimes with signs listing their diagnosis. These weren't for family albums. They were for medical journals and public display, reinforcing the idea that insanity had a look, a type. These faces became the propaganda of control. And of course, literature and theater loved the asylum trope. Gothic novels like Jane Eyre and The Woman in White used the madwoman in the attic as both villain and victim, always isolated, often imprisoned, rarely understood. These stories mirrored society's real anxieties about women, class, power, and the thin line between sanity and rebellion. In truth, Victorian asylums didn't just house the mad. They helped define what madness meant. They were social mirrors, reflecting everything the era feared: disorder, deviance, sexuality, and loss of control. And for many, being labeled insane was not the end of a journey. It was a lifelong sentence written in whispers and watched through iron bars. By the end of the Victorian era, the asylum system had become a paradox, born from reform, fed by fear, and sustained by silence. Institutions meant to offer sanctuary had become places of permanent exile. The 20th century would eventually bring changes, some overdue, some still flawed. But the shadows cast by Victorian mental asylums linger even now. Many of the beliefs that shaped those institutions didn't vanish overnight. Ideas about undesirable behavior, gender roles, and moral madness slowly bled into modern psychiatry, into criminal justice, even into how families handled illness behind closed doors. Many Victorian-era asylums stood for decades beyond their prime. Vast, crumbling buildings that became symbols of everything that went wrong. Some were converted into housing. Others were demolished. A few were simply abandoned, their corridors left to rot with a graffiti of time still etched in the paint. But what about the people? Tens of thousands died inside those institutions, some from illness, some from abuse, many from sheer neglect. Their graves were often unmarked. Their files, if they survived, are now stored in archives with tragic footnotes like never spoken again or believed to be possessed. They vanished behind stone walls and history moved on. Yet their stories matter. Because the Victorian asylum wasn't just a physical structure, it was a cultural machine, one that taught society how to treat the vulnerable, isolate them, silence them, punish them for being inconvenient. And while we like to believe we've evolved, echoes of that system remain in underfunded mental health care and stigma, in families too ashamed to speak openly, and prisons overflowing with the mentally ill. There's no simple moral to the tale. The Victorians weren't cartoon villains. Many doctors truly believed they were helping. Some were kind. Some patients did improve, but intention doesn't erase impact. And what started as an attempt at compassion became a machinery of confinement, brutal, sprawling, and deeply human in its failures. Today we walk past the ruins of those asylums and barely glance at the plaques. But if you stop, you might feel it. That strange, heavy stillness, the residue of stories untold, lives forgotten, voices that were never heard. And maybe that's the legacy worth remembering. Not just the institutions, but the people inside them. Because in the end, what we choose to forget says just as much as what we remember. Cuthalin was not your average royal from the moment of her birth, around the year 1260. She was destined to defy expectations, not just as a woman, but as a warrior. She was born into the heart of the Mongol world, a nomadic empire that had conquered much of Eurasia in a single century. Her father, Kaidu Khan, was no minor chieftain. He was a formidable leader in his own right, a direct descendant of Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's third son. Kaidu ruled over the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and was a fierce rival of his cousin Kublai Khan, who ruled the wealthier eastern domains from China. The Mongol world was vast but divided, and Kaidu was determined to preserve the traditional ways of the steppe, rugged, mobile, and rooted in martial prowess. From a young age, Cuthalin was raised not as a sheltered princess, but as a warrior. In Mongol culture, girls were taught to ride almost as soon as they could walk archery. Horseback hunting and battlefield tactics were not exclusive to boys, but Cuthalin took things further. She didn't just learn to fight, she excelled at it. By her teenage years, she was riding beside her father on military campaigns, commanding troops, and earning a reputation not just as a noblewoman, but as a devastating force of nature, according to chroniclers like Marco Polo and Rashid al-Din. Cuthalin stood out even among the hardened warriors of her time. Her physical strength was legendary. She could pin grown men to the ground in wrestling matches. She could gallop into battle, wielding a bow or spear with deadly precision. And she wasn't just a sideshow. She was a commander, feared by her enemies and respected by her allies. Her upbringing was unique in the Mongol world, but not entirely unprecedented. Mongol women had always enjoyed more freedom than their counterparts in Europe or the Islamic world. Still, Cuthalin shattered even those boundaries. She wasn't content to remain in the background, managing domestic affairs. She wanted to fight, lead, and challenge the very idea of what a royal woman could be. She was the daughter of a Khan, but she was also her own kind of conqueror, and soon the entire steppe would know her name. Of all the stories surrounding Cuthalin, one tale echoes louder than the rest, a tale that turned her from warrior to legend. By the time she reached marriageable age, Cuthalin had already proven herself in battle, outmaneuvered rival commanders, and solidified her place beside her father as a trusted military advisor. Yet one question lingered in the minds of every neighboring ruler and royal court. Who would marry her? Cuthalin had an answer. She would only marry a man who could defeat her in wrestling. Not archery, not swordplay. Wrestling. This wasn't just a game. Mongol wrestling, or Burk, was an elite sport, one of the three manly skills alongside archery and horsemanship. It required strength, balance, endurance, and ferocious will. Matches could last for hours, and Cuthalin didn't just participate. She dominated. She made her challenge public. Any man who wished to marry her must first best her on the wrestling field. If they lost, they had to forfeit a large number of horses, usually 100. But some legends say even more and lose. They did one after another. Strong men, warriors, nobles, each came with confidence and left with bruises and broken pride, some accounts. Particularly the dramatized ones by foreign travelers like Marco Polo claimed that Cuthalin amassed a herd of 10,000 horses from these failed suitors. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was clear. She had turned traditional courtship into a trial of strength, and no man measured up. To her people, this wasn't scandalous. It was awe-inspiring. Cuthalin became the embodiment of the steppe's ideals. Fierce, free, and unconquered, her defiance of convention didn't diminish her femininity. It redefined it. She didn't reject marriage outright, but she refused to surrender to weakness, status, or political convenience. Of course, her parents, especially her mother, were less enthused. Kaido may have admired his daughter's prowess, but he also had dynastic ambitions. A strategic marriage could have secured alliances. But Cuthalin held firm. She would not be bartered or bound, not unless her chosen match could take her down with his own strength. None ever did. This vow wasn't just about love. It was a statement, a living declaration that no man, no matter how rich or royal, could own her unless he earned it through force and respect. And in that ring, Cuthalin remained undefeated. Cuthalin wasn't just a champion in the wrestling ring. She was a terror on the battlefield. From her teenage years onward, she rode alongside her father, Qaida Khan, as he led campaigns across Central Asia in his long-standing war against Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty. These were no ceremonial rides. Cuchulainn fought in full armor, commanded troops, and made tactical decisions that earned her the fear and respect of seasoned generals. The Mongol way of war was brutal, fast, and highly coordinated cavalry maneuvers, feigned retreats, and ambushes were all part of the game, and Cuchulainn mastered it. One account, likely exaggerated but rooted in truth, claims she would ride into enemy lines and snatch up a prisoner as easily as a hawk plucks a chicken. This wasn't poetry. It was how Mongols assessed greatness through action. Her battlefield prowess was so formidable that her father reportedly considered naming her as his heir, not just to his household or his horses, but to the leadership of the entire Chagatai Khanate. This was no small thing. Mongol politics were deeply patriarchal, especially when it came to succession. Leadership wasn't simply inherited, it had to be won, endorsed by powerful male nobles and military leaders. For Kaidu to even consider Cuchulainn as his successor meant she had done more than earn his trust. She had proven time and again that she was a commander equal to or better than her brothers, but therein lay the problem. Cuchulainn had many brothers, 15 by most counts, and not all of them were fond of being outshone by their sister. Resentment simmered. Whispers of jealousy and scandal began to circulate, some even suggesting that her closeness to her father was unnatural. Others accused her of seeking too much power for a woman. Yet Kaidu stood by her. During his many campaigns against the Yuan dynasty and their allies, Cuchulainn remained one of his most reliable commanders. She led her own units, charged into battle, and brought home victories. Soldiers followed her, not because of her name, but because of her record. She wasn't a token warrior. She was the real thing. And with every campaign, her legend grew, not just as a woman among men, but as a warrior among warriors. As Cuchulainn's fame on the battlefield surged, so did the whispers. To her father, Kaidu Khan, Cuchulainn was more than just a daughter. She was his right hand, his most trusted general, and according to some sources, his preferred successor. While her brothers bickered and schemed, Cuchulainn remained unwavering in her loyalty. She was bold, strategic, and brutally effective. In a world where trust could mean life or death, Kaidu had no doubts about her. But the rest of the Mongol aristocracy wasn't as confident. The idea of a woman inheriting power, let alone ruling an entire Kharate, was enough to send shockwaves through the traditionalist ranks. Sure, Mongol women had historically enjoyed more freedom than their counterparts in other parts of the medieval world. They could own property, advise on politics, even ride into war. But to rule outright, that was a different story. As Kaidu's health began to decline, the issue of succession became urgent. Cuchulainn remained his obvious choice in terms of loyalty and merit. But politics doesn't always reward merit. Her brothers, cousins, and various Mongol nobles saw an opportunity to block her rise, and they began to act. Some spread rumors that her relationship with Kaidu was inappropriate, crossing lines of familial closeness. Others accused her of using sorcery or feminine manipulation to win influence. These weren't just idle gossip. They were calculated attacks meant to discredit her in the eyes of the tribal councils. But Cuchulainn didn't back down. She continued to appear at Kaidu's side during military councils. She commanded troops with the same unshakable confidence. Her power was visible, undeniable. And yet it wasn't enough. Even her father began to sense the political storm brewing. Despite his unwavering support, he could see that naming her as heir might divide the Khanate, or worse, spark a civil war after his death. Mongol rule depended on strength and unity. A disputed succession could unravel everything he had built. In the end, Kaidu never officially named Cuchulainn his successor, not because she was unworthy, but because her worth made her dangerous to those clinging to an old world. She had fought harder, led better, and remained more loyal than any man around her. And still, the throne stayed just out of reach for now. For years, Cuchulainn had stood firm. She would only marry the man who could defeat her in wrestling. None had succeeded, and with every broken suitor sent home horseless, her legend grew, along with the pressure to abandon her vow. Kaidu's tolerance had limits. While he respected her independence and military skill, he was still a father, and more importantly, a Khan with political obligations. The Mongol world was built on strategic marriages, and Kaidu needed alliances to strengthen his hold against Kublai Khan and rival tribes. Having an unmarried daughter, even one as formidable as Cuchulainn, left a glaring opportunity untapped. Eventually, the tension became too great to ignore. Kaidu, under pressure from his advisors and other noble houses, reportedly urged Cuchulainn to reconsider her terms. The political climate was shifting. Her victories on the battlefield, while impressive, were no longer enough to shield her from internal expectations, and so, reluctantly, Cuchulainn married. The identity of her husband remained shrouded in mystery. Some sources say he was a man accused of plotting against Kaidu, and the marriage was her way of demonstrating loyalty to her father, choosing to wed the accused man herself to prove his innocence. Others claim the man was selected for political reasons, someone deemed worthy by the tribal council, even if he hadn't bested her in sport. What is certain, however, is that Cuchulainn did not marry for love, and she did not marry on her own terms. Her wrestling challenge disappeared. Her resistance, at least publicly, had ended, but if her opponents expected her to fade quietly into domestic life, they were sorely mistaken. Even after marriage, Cuchulainn continued to command troops. She still rode into battle. She maintained her position at her father's side until his final days. The title of wife changed little about her role in the political and military affairs of the Chagatai Khanate. Still, her marriage marked the beginning of a shift. The legend of the unconquered warrior princess had met the realities of dynastic politics. Even Cuchulainn, fierce as she was, could not completely escape the demands of the world she was born into. Yet she had made her point on the battlefield, on the wrestling ground, and in the hearts of her people. She had never been defeated. Not really. In 1301, everything changed. Qaida Khan, the powerful warlord who had defied Kublai Khan, kept the western steppe in check and trusted his daughter more than any of his sons, died. His passing sent a tremor through the Chagatai Khanate. Without a clear successor, the line of inheritance fractured immediately. Kaidu had never officially named Cuchulainn as his heir, despite her unmatched military record and steadfast loyalty. Whether he feared political backlash or believed the nobles would never accept a woman, he left the throne open, and the wolves descended. Her brothers, particularly Oris and Chupar, scrambled to fill the vacuum. Some claimed Kaidu had whispered a name on his deathbed. Others insisted they had always been the rightful heirs. What followed wasn't just a succession debate. It was a power struggle laced with betrayal, rivalry, and violence. Cuchulainn didn't stand idle. Though she may not have been formally recognized as the Khan's successor, she wielded more influence than most of her male relatives combined. Her support or opposition could make or break a claim. Soldiers still followed her. Local leaders still respected her. Many believed she should rule, and there are reports, fragmentary and debated, that Cuchulainn attempted to claim leadership in the immediate aftermath of Kaidu's death. If true, this would have made her one of the few women in Mongol history to vie openly for power at the Khanal level. But the odds were against her. The steppe's traditions were not ready to accept a female Khan, no matter how capable she was. The same commanders who had once praised her in battle now turned to her brothers, fearing the political instability that might come from breaking patriarchal norms. Cuchulainn's opposition grew louder. Her options grew fewer. In the end, Chapa seized power, backed by influential nobles and opportunists. Cuchulainn was sidelined, but not entirely erased. She continued to hold command in her own territory, and remained a feared presence. Still, the reins of the Khanate slipped through her fingers. It was a bitter turn. The woman who had fought beside her father for decades was denied the chance to lead in his place. But Cuchulainn didn't disappear. She watched, she advised, and she waited. Even in defeat, she was never diminished as the dust settled from Kaidu's death and the succession battles cooled. Cuchulainn found herself in a strange position, still powerful, still feared, but increasingly isolated. Her brother Chapa now held formal control of the Khanate, though his rule was tenuous at best. He lacked Kaidu's charisma, Cuchulainn's military brilliance, and the loyalty of many tribal leaders. The political landscape had become unstable. Alliances shifted quickly to the Mongol Empire. Once united by Genghis Khan's iron will, had splintered into competing factions, each led by Khans more concerned with self-preservation and unity. Cuchulainn remained at the edge of this chaos. She still commanded warriors loyal to her. She still advised in military matters. But the Open RD leadership had closed. Her position was now more symbolic, an icon of what could have been and then. Just as quietly as she had emerged decades earlier, Cuchulainn vanished from the record. She died in 1306, her exact cause of death unknown. No chronicles detail her final battle, or whether she died in war or peace. There were no grand funerals recorded, no epics composed at the time, just a sudden silence. Some speculate she was assassinated by political enemies. Others believe she died of illness. A few wonder if she chose exile, retreating into obscurity once it became clear that her time had passed. But the lack of details does not erase the weight of her legacy. Cuchulainn had lived her life by her own code, fierce, loyal, and unbending. She had out-wrestled every man who tried to conquer her. She had ridden into battle, not as decoration, but as a general. She had earned her father's trust and nearly ruled in his place. In a world dominated by men, she stood as an equal and often their superior. No husband had ever defeated her. No enemy had ever conquered her. Even in death, she remained unconquered in memory. While her brothers' names faded into the footnotes of Mongol history, Cuchulainn became a legend. Her name would live on in the tales told around fires, in the whispers of traveling merchants, and eventually, in the pages of history books written centuries later. She may have died quietly, but nothing about her life had ever been quiet. Cuchulainn's physical presence may have disappeared in 1306, but her legend refused to die. For centuries, her story traveled not through formal chronicles, but by word of mouth, carried by nomads across the steppes, by traders on the Silk Road, and by foreign visitors both fascinated and confused by the memory of a woman who had wrestled her way into history. One of the earliest outsiders to mention her was Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler who visited the Mongol court in the late 13th century. He spoke of a warrior princess who could ride into enemy ranks and seize a man as easily as a hawk snatches a chicken. Though his accounts are often colored with exaggeration, Polo's portrayal helped enshrine Cuchulainn in the Western imagination, not just as a curiosity, but as a marvel. Later chroniclers like Rashid al-Din included her in their histories, focusing more on her martial abilities and her unusual vow of wrestling for marriage. While these accounts differ in detail, they all agree on the essentials. Cuchulainn was a woman of extraordinary strength, intelligence, and autonomy in a world that rarely allowed such traits to flourish in women. And then came the transformation from legend to symbol centuries after her death. Cuchulainn's story was reimagined in various forms. In the 18th century, her life inspired a French opera titled Turandot, though with a heavy European twist. In this version, Cuchulainn becomes the icy Chinese princess who refuses to marry any man unless he can solve her riddles. Those who fail are executed. While the bloodthirsty tone has little to do with the historical Cuchulainn, but it shows how powerful her legend had become. So powerful that it could be reshaped, absorbed, and misrepresented across cultures. The most famous adaptation, of course, came in the 20th century with Puccini's opera Turandot. Audiences around the world heard Cuchullainn's story without ever hearing her name. The woman behind the myth was lost in translation, but not erased. Today, historians and feminist scholars have worked to reclaim her truth from the fog of fiction. In Mongolia and Central Asia, Cuchulainn is celebrated as a national hero, a symbol of female strength and resistance. Statues have been raised in her honor. Her name lives on in popular retellings, both academic and poetic, because long after empires fall, stories endure, and hers still thunders like hooves across the steppe, in a world still grappling with the limits placed on women, on who they're allowed to be, what they're permitted to achieve. Cuchulainn's story resonates more than ever. She wasn't a queen tucked away in a palace, nor a passive figurehead married off for diplomacy. She was a general, a wrestler, a tactician, and a daughter who might have become a ruler. Her life remains a fierce rebuttal to the idea that women in history were always silent, always obedient, always sidelined. Cuchulainn wasn't. Across Central Asia today, Cuchulainn's name is spoken with pride. In Mongolia, she is hailed as a symbol of female power, a true descendant of Genghis Khan, who proved that strength and femininity were never mutually exclusive. In wrestling circles, her name is evoked with reverence. Some even consider her the spiritual mother of Burke, Mongolian wrestling itself. Women who take up arms or challenge tradition are often compared to her. She has become a cultural shorthand for fearless defiance. Modern scholars and authors have also begun restoring her story to its rightful place. While earlier generations remembered her through warped Western lenses, romanticized, exoticized, or misrepresented, contemporary historians are sifting through the layers, reclaiming the true Cuchulainn. Not a fairy tale princess, but a real human being who demanded to live on her terms. She's inspired children's books, documentaries, and academic theses. Her legacy has also seeped into pop culture, appearing in shows like Marco Polo, where she's portrayed as a fierce warrior, unafraid to speak her mind or challenge tradition. Though dramatized, these portrayals at least reintroduce her to modern audiences, inviting them to dig deeper. Her story is also part of a broader effort to rewrite the historical narrative to make space for the voices long ignored or misrepresented. Cuchulainn isn't just a historical footnote. She's a chapter that was almost erased, now rediscovered, and perhaps that's her greatest victory. She lived in an era where power was measured in strength, loyalty, and legacy, and she mastered all three. No man ever conquered her in sport. No army ever crushed her in war. And no culture, no empire, no time period could silence her completely. Cuchulainn lives on, as legend, as symbol, and as proof that sometimes the fiercest warrior wears a braid, not a crown. Imagine a world without hospitals, surgical theaters, or even a fixed address. Now imagine thriving in it. For the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, from the Scythians and Sarmatians to the Turks and Mongols, this wasn't a temporary state. It was a way of life, always on the move. Chasing grazing pastures and evading enemies, they had no luxury for stationary institutions. And yet they developed a remarkably effective system of medicine, fluid, adaptive, and as mobile as the people it served. Nomadic medicine wasn't centered around buildings or bureaucracy. It was carried on horseback, stored in saddlebags, and passed down through spoken word, observation, and spiritual ritual. There were no clinics, no white coats. The healer came to you, or sometimes rode beside you into battle. This was medicine born out of necessity and honed by generations of intimate observation of the land, animals, and people. Nomads treated wounds in the field under the open sky. They cured infections and felt tense. They delivered babies miles from the nearest settlement. Their methods may seem simple to modernize, but they were anything but primitive. Theirs was a holistic approach. Healing was not just about treating a physical symptom. It was about restoring balance between body, soul, and spirit. Illness was often seen as the result of disharmony with the natural world, with one's ancestors, or with unseen spirits. And so medicine among the steppe peoples was never just a science. It was also deeply spiritual. Knowledge came not from books, but from lived experience. The role of healer often fell to shamans, elders, or those with an inherited calling. They memorized plant lore, knew how to reduce fevers with goat's milk or willow bark, and could set a broken bone using leather straps and smooth river stones. But they also spoke to spirits, performed purification rituals, and interpreted dreams. Nomadic medicine was shaped by resilience. You couldn't wait for a specialist. You had to know how to act quickly and wisely. Every rider, every mother, every elder was expected to know something about health because survival depended on it. In a world that moved with the wind and lived on horseback, medicine had to keep up. And somehow it did. In the world of nomadic medicine, the most powerful healer wasn't a doctor in a white coat. It was the shaman. Shamans held a unique place in steppe societies. They were part healer, part priest, part psychologist, and part performer. Often chosen through visions, dreams, or signs of spiritual sensitivity, shamans were believed to walk between worlds, the physical and the spiritual, the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. To a nomadic community, illness wasn't just a biological problem. It could be the result of offending a spirit, angering an ancestor, or being struck by the malevolent gaze of an evil eye. Physical symptoms were interpreted through a spiritual lens. That's where the shaman came in. When someone fell ill, especially with no clear injury or explanation, the shaman was summoned. Dressed in elaborate robes made of fur, feathers, bones, and bells, they would enter a trance, sometimes with the help of rhythmic drumming, chanting, or inhaling smoke from sacred herbs. In this altered state, the shaman would attempt to communicate with spirits to find a source of the illness. Healing rituals might involve drawing illness out of the body with the help of talismans or feathers, chanting protective spells, or using sacred objects like mirrors to reflect spiritual harm. Some rituals required sacrifices of animals, milk, or incense to appease the spirit world. But shamans weren't only spiritual mediators. They were also practical healers. Many had a deep understanding of medicinal herbs, midwifery, and emergency care. They could dress wounds, reduce fevers, and treat common ailments. What made them unique was that they saw the body and soul as one, never separated. Interestingly, shamans often served multiple communities across the steppe. Their fame spread not through social media, but through oral tradition. A powerful healer might be summoned from hundreds of miles away to perform a cure. Gender roles varied. In some cultures, shamans were predominantly male. In others, especially among Turkic and Siberian nomads, female shamans were equally respected. Some were even gender fluid, seen as spiritually powerful because they existed outside conventional roles. In times of illness, it was the shaman's tent that offered both comfort and confrontation, a place where healing meant facing not only your pain, but the spirits behind it. To the nomads, health was not just about survival. It was about balance with the world you rode through and the worlds you couldn't see. With no apothecaries or stock pharmacies, nomadic healers relied on what the land offered, and the steppe offered more than you'd think. The vast grasslands of Central Asia, Siberia, and the Caucasus weren't just grazing territory for horses and sheep. They were medicine cabinets, plants, minerals, and animal parts. Every natural element was fair game for healing knowledge of. These remedies were passed down orally, generation to generation, often guarded by elders, midwives, and shamans. Take the yarrow plant, for example. Common across Eurasia, it was crushed into a poultice to stop bleeding. Willow bark, which contains salicin, compound from which aspirin is derived, was brewed into tea to treat fevers and inflammation. Juniper berries were burned in ritual purification, but also brewed as a tonic for digestive issues, and used to disinfect wounds. Garlic, wild onions, and fermented mare's milk arag were frequently used as immunity boosters. Herbal treatments weren't just about ingredients, they were about timing. Plants were gathered at specific times of year, under specific moon phases, or after particular rituals. Some herbs were dried and stored in leather pouches. Others had to be used fresh. The preparation was just as important as the plant itself. Animal-based medicine also had its place. Yak or sheep fat was used to treat frostbite. Bear bile and deer antler shavings were believed to boost vitality. Horse milk, rich in vitamin C, was not only a daily drink, but also a common remedy for weakness, fatigue, and even depression. And then there were stones and minerals. Powdered limestone was sometimes applied to wounds to dry them out. Sulfur was burned to cleanse sick tents. Salt was essential not only for preservation, but for purging and disinfecting. What's striking about nomadic pharmacology is its holistic nature. Remedies were rarely administered alone. A tea came with a prayer. A wound was treated while a charm was tied around a wrist. Physical and spiritual healing went hand in hand. Healers knew their environments intimately. They could look at a patch of wildflowers and tell you which were safe to eat, which could calm a cough, and which would kill a man by morning. That knowledge wasn't written down. It was live. And if you wanted to survive the open steppe, you didn't just need a sword. You needed someone who could tell roots from poison. Nomadic life wasn't just about tending livestock or herding across open plains. It was a life of war, raids, and physical hardship. And when bones cracked or blood flowed, healing had to be swift, smart, and mobile. Battlefield medicine was a vital skill among nomads. especially for warrior cultures like the Scythians, Huns, Turks, and Mongols. In these societies, everyone knew how to ride and fight, and that meant injuries were common. From broken ribs to deep lacerations, nomadic healers had to act fast, often with nothing more than a saddlebag of tools and a sharp mind. Bone setting was one of the most valued healing arts. Dislocations, fractures, and joint injuries were treated using surprisingly advanced techniques. Healers used animal sinew or strips of rawhide as makeshift splints. Smooth stones or carved bone braces kept limbs immobile. Dislocated joints were popped back into place with controlled leverage, a skill that was part art, part brute force. Wounds were cleaned using boiled water, alcohol from fermented milk, or infused herbal tonics. Cauterization was commonly practiced, heating a metal tool in fire and pressing it to a wound to stop bleeding and prevent infection. Painful, yes, but effective. It meant the difference between life and death in an age before antibiotics. Suturing techniques also existed. Horsehair or sheep gut could be used as thread, and bone needles were common. Wounds were stitched, then sealed with natural resins or animal fat to protect them from dirt and bacteria. In serious cases, bloodletting was employed, not always out of superstition, but as a method to relieve swelling, bruising, or perceived imbalances in the body. Horns, blades, and even leeches were used, depending on the tribe and the condition. Interestingly, battlefield surgery didn't only happen after a fight. It often took place during it. Some shamans or senior warriors carried small kits to dress wounds mid-battle. Quick thinking and crude field dressings kept soldiers fighting longer and helped prevent infection from setting in early. Even dentistry wasn't ignored. Cracked or rotting teeth were pulled using iron tools for toothaches. They applied a paste made of clove oil, ground bone, and wild herbs directly to the gum. Nomads couldn't afford long recovery times. Their medicine had to be portable, fast, and effective. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And when you live in a world where danger gallops just over the next hill, that's all that matters. Among nomadic peoples, the birth of a child was both a blessing and a battlefield. Without permanent shelters, maternity wards, or trained obstetricians, childbirth on the steppe was a dangerous yet sacred event handled almost entirely by women, using a mix of experience, herbal knowledge, spiritual ritual, and sheer resilience. Midwives were central to this world. They weren't formally trained, but they carried generations of knowledge passed down through observation and oral tradition. These women knew how to position a baby, how to soothe a mother in labor, and how to act fast when things went wrong. Births typically happened inside jairs or yurts, the felt-covered tents of the steppe, which could be made warm, clean, and private. The mother would squat, stand, or lean against another woman during delivery, positions that used gravity to assist the birth and minimize prolonged labor. The midwife monitored the baby's position, adjusted the mother's breathing, and massaged her abdomen to encourage contractions. Pain management came through both herbal remedies and ritual. A tea made of valerian root or wild poppy might be used to calm the mother's nerves. Juniper smoke was often burned to cleanse the space and drive away malevolent spirits. The presence of charms, amulets, and whispered blessings helped create a sense of protection. If complications arose, breech birth, hemorrhaging, retained placenta, the midwife had limited options, but a lifetime of practiced intuition. Herbs like shepherd's purse or yarrow were used to control bleeding. Pressure techniques and warm compresses were applied to help reposition the fetus. In rare cases, forced delivery by hand might be attempted, a dangerous move, but sometimes the only choice. Once the baby was born, horse milk or warm sheep's milk was often the first nourishment, especially if the mother was weak. The umbilical cord was cut with a sterilized knife or flint. Then tied with a string soaked in alcohol or brine, the baby was swaddled in felt and anointed with protective symbols, sometimes soot or oils placed on the forehead or chest. Infant mortality was high, but when both mother and child survived, it was cause for major celebration. The newborn was not just a child, it was the future of the clan, another rider for the endless steppe. And for nomads, that meant everything. Not all illnesses came from wounds or weather. Sometimes the body broke without explanation. A man would grow weak despite eating well. A child would stop speaking. A warrior would suffer nightmares and refuse to ride. These were not just illnesses, they were signs of a spirit sickness. For the nomads of the steppe, the invisible was just as real as the visible. They believed in spiritual imbalance, curses, or offended ancestors could manifest as disease. This wasn't superstition. It was an integrated part of their worldview, where health depended on harmony between the physical and the spiritual. When someone fell mysteriously ill, they didn't always call the midwife or the bone setter. They called the shaman. The shaman would examine the symptoms, not just physical ones, but emotional and behavioral changes. Was the patient talking to unseen things? Had they become withdrawn? Were they unusually angry or afraid? These were signs that the illness came from another world. Diagnosis involves ritual. The shaman might burn herbs like mugwort or juniper, chant to the ancestors, or use objects like bones, mirrors, or drums to read the spirit world. The illness could be caused by a wandering soul, an angry ancestor, or a demonic force. Sometimes it was said that the person's soul had left the body and become lost. To heal, the shaman performed soul retrieval rituals. These were dramatic events. The shaman might don elaborate costumes, mimic the behavior of animals, or speak in strange voices. All of this was intended to draw the spirit's attention, negotiate its return, or chase away harmful forces. Talismans were placed under pillows. Protective tattoos were drawn. Salt circles were laid around a ear. Some shamans used animal sacrifices, offering the blood of a lamb or goat to appease the spirit realm. For more common spiritual afflictions like nightmares, infertility, or melancholy, smaller rituals were held. Dreamcatcher-like charms made of bones, feathers, and thread were hung over sleeping areas. Special songs were sung. Milk or vodka was poured as an offering to the spirits, what modern medicine might call trauma, depression, or psychosis. Nomadic societies are treated through story, ritual, and deep communal care. The illness was not just yours. It affected the tribe, and healing meant bringing the whole world back into balance. In the absence of medical schools or written manuals, how did nomadic societies preserve and pass down medical knowledge? The answer: collective memory. Nomadic medicine was not centralized in universities or locked away in elite circles. It lived in the mouths of elders, in the hands of mothers, and in the practices of every rider, hunter, and healer. It was communal, taught through demonstration, remembered through story, and refined through lived experience on the open steppe. Children grew up watching injuries treated after horse falls or fevers soothed with herbal steam by the time they reached adulthood. They knew the basics: how to stop bleeding with moss, how to prepare root tea for stomach cramps, and how to recognize the signs of a spiritual affliction. Knowledge wasn't given through formal lessons, it was embedded in daily life. Elders played a crucial role. Grandmothers especially were often walking encyclopedias of medicinal knowledge. They knew which plants to gather in spring, how to prepare a poultice for swollen joints, or how to ease childbirth pains with rhythmic chanting and breath control. Many acted as informal doctors within the clan, treating ailments while telling stories that carried layers of coded advice and health wisdom. Shamans trained apprentices not through classrooms, but through mentorship. A chosen pupil might spend years learning how to interpret dreams, prepare ritual tools, or enter trance states safely. The training was personal, intuitive, and deeply spiritual. There were no exams, but failure could mean disaster for both patient and healer. The communal nature of knowledge also meant that nomadic medicine could adapt. If a new herb was discovered while migrating to unfamiliar lands, its effects were tested, documented orally, and shared. A new treatment might be tried on a sick animal before a human. If it worked, it became part of the tribe's living knowledge. This oral tradition had its vulnerabilities. Disease outbreaks could wipe out entire family lines and their medicinal wisdom with them. But it also had its strengths. It was flexible, dynamic, and resilient. It could travel with the tribe, change with the seasons, and adapt to new threats. In a world where everything moved, the one constant was memory, not written in books, but in the rhythm of everyday life. A knowledge passed not by pen, but by firelight, sweat, and story. For nomadic societies, animals weren't just companions or commodities. They were lifelines. Horses, sheep, yaks, goats, and camels formed the backbone of steppe economies, culture, and even spiritual life. So naturally, caring for animal health was just as critical as healing human wounds, sometimes more so. Animal medicine was a highly developed parallel system, often overseen by the same people who treated human ailments. In fact, the line between veterinary and human medicine was blurred. If something could heal a sick goat, it might work for a person, and vice versa. The bond between rider and horse especially shaped a deep understanding of physiology, trauma, and recovery. Common illnesses like hoof rot, skin infections, respiratory issues, or parasites were treated with herbal mixtures, poultices, and smoke. Burned juniper and wormwood smoke wasn't just used for humans, it was also waved over stables to disinfect the air and repel pests. Fleas and ticks were driven off with crushed garlic rubbed into the animal's fur or skin. For deeper infections or open wounds, healers might use heated metal to cauterize, just like with humans. Horse fat or sheep tallow was applied to wounds to prevent cracking and promote healing, especially in winter. Broken bones in animals were rare but not impossible, and were treated with wooden braces and tightly wrapped leather bindings, followed by enforced rest. The animal might be hobbled or kept close to camp while it healed. Colic in horses, a potentially fatal condition, was treated with massaging, herbal tonics, and in some cases forced walking to restart the digestive system. For milk animals, mastitis, a breast infection, was known and treated with warm compresses and constant milking to relieve pressure. What's remarkable is that these treatments were learned without books, lab testing, or diagnostics. They came from generational observation, close living with animals. A nomadic herder could look at a camel's gait and know something was wrong. A grandmother could hear the tone of a sheep's bleat and recognize fever. The spiritual dimension was never far off either. Animals were believed to be affected by spirits, just like people. A shaman might bless a sick horse or perform a cleansing ritual for a herd stricken with illness, because if the animals died, the people didn't just lose wealth. They lost movement, milk, meat, and mobility. Healing the herd meant healing the heart of nomadic life. Though modern hospitals, pharmaceuticals, and globalized healthcare have changed the way we view medicine, the legacy of nomadic healing still lingers. Quietly resilient, often overlooked, but remarkably enduring. Many of the remedies once carried in leather pouches and whispered in windswept tents have found validation in modern science. Willow bark is now recognized as the natural precursor to aspirin. Juniper smoke is understood to have antimicrobial properties. Techniques like bone setting, herbal poultices, and warm compresses continue to be used around the world, some unchanged for centuries. But more than the remedies themselves, it's the philosophy behind nomadic medicine that still speaks to us today. Steppe healing was built on adaptability. It didn't rely on sterile labs or climate-controlled pharmacies. It relied on being observant, inventive, and grounded in nature. It wasn't about cure so much as balance, restoring harmony between the body, community, the spirit world, and the land. This mindset is returning. In a world increasingly overwhelmed by synthetic quick fixes and impersonal healthcare systems, there's a growing hunger for holistic medicine. For plant-based treatments and for respectful integration of traditional knowledge, what was once dismissed as superstition is now being re-evaluated as a body of experiential wisdom, tested, adapted, and preserved through the sheer necessity of survival. In Mongolia and across Central Asia, nomadic medicine is still practiced. Healers still prepare teas from wild herbs, still perform shamanic rituals, still teach children the signs of a sick animal, or the first symptom of frostbite. Even among modernized populations, remnants of this tradition persist, woven into cultural identity like thread through felt. Of course, not all steppe medicine was safe or effective. Some rituals were based on belief rather than biology. But the human insight, the awareness of emotional health, the power of communal care, the role of nature in healing remains timeless. Nomadic medicine teaches us that healing doesn't have to be high-tech to be profound. It shows that care can exist in a tent, on a mountain, in the middle of nowhere. That a healer doesn't need a degree to be wise. That health is as much about connection to people, to place, to purpose, as it is about biology. And in that lesson, the steppe still speaks.